Today, in Audiobooks for Me, we are going to listen to The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie. This book is divided in 3 videos. This is Part 2. We hope you enjoy it. Chapter 10. The parlourmaid. We found Mrs. Ackroyd in the hall. With her was a small, dried-up little man with an aggressive chin and sharp grey eyes, and lawyer written all over him. "Mr. Hammond is staying to lunch with us," said Mrs. Ackroyd. "You know Major Blunt, Mr. Hammond? And dear Dr. Sheppard, also a close friend of poor Roger's. And let me see—" She paused, surveying Hercule Poirot in some perplexity. "This is Monsieur Poirot, mother," said Flora. "I told you about him this morning." "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Ackroyd vaguely. "Of course, my dear, of course. He is to find Ralph, is he not?" "He is to find out who killed Uncle," said Flora. "Oh, my dear," cried her mother. "Please, my poor nerves. I'm a wreck this morning, a positive wreck. Such a dreadful thing to happen. I can't help feeling that it must have been an accident of some kind. Roger was so fond of handling queer curios. His hand must have slipped or something." This theory was received in polite silence. I saw Poirot edge up to the lawyer and speak to him in a confidential undertone. They moved aside into the embrasure of the window. I joined them, then hesitated. "Perhaps I'm intruding," I said. "Not at all," cried Poirot heartily. "You and I, Monsieur le Docteur, we investigate this affair side by side. Without you, I should be lost. I desire a little information from the good Mr. Hammond." "You are acting on behalf of Captain Ralph Parton, I understand," said the lawyer cautiously. Poirot shook his head. "Not so. I am acting in the interests of justice. Miss Ackroyd has asked me to investigate the death of her uncle." Mr. Hammond seemed slightly taken aback. "I cannot seriously believe that Captain Peyton can be concerned in this crime," he said, "however strong the circumstantial evidence against him may be. The mere fact that he was hard-pressed for money—" "Was he hard-pressed for money?" interpolated Poirot quickly. The lawyer shrugged his shoulders. "It was a chronic condition with Ralph Patten," he said dryly. "Money went through his hands like water. He was always applying to his stepfather." "Had he done so of late? During the last year, for instance?" "I cannot say. Mr. Ackroyd did not mention the fact to me." "I comprehend. Mr. Hammond, I take it that you are acquainted with the provisions of Mr. Ackroyd's will?" "Certainly, that is my principal business here today." "Then, seeing that I am acting for Miss Ackroyd, you will not object to telling me the terms of that will? They are quite simple, shorn of legal phraseology and after paying certain legacies and bequests." "Such as—" interrupted Poirot. Mr. Hammond seemed a little surprised. £1,000 to his housekeeper, Miss Russell, £50 to the cook, Emma Cooper, £500 to his secretary, Mr. Geoffrey Raymond, then to various hospitals. Poirot held up his hand. "Ah, the charitable bequests, they interest me not." "Quite so. The income on £10,000 worth of shares to be paid to Mrs. Cecil Ackroyd during her lifetime. Miss Flora Ackroyd inherits £20,000 outright. The residue, including this property and the shares in Ackroyd and Son, to his adopted son, Ralph Peyton." "Mr. Ackroyd possessed a large fortune?" "A very large fortune. Captain Peyton will be an exceedingly wealthy young man." There was a silence. Poirot and the lawyer looked at each other. "Mr. Hammond," came Mrs. Ackroyd's voice plaintively from the fireplace. The lawyer answered the summons. Poirot took my arm and drew me right into the window. "Regard the irises," he remarked in rather a loud voice. "Magnificent, are they not? A straight and pleasing effect." At the same time, I felt the pressure of his hand on my arm, and he added in a low tone, "Do you really wish to aid me, to take part in this investigation?" "Yes, indeed," I said eagerly. There's nothing I should like better. You don't know what a dull old fogey's life I lead. Never anything out of the ordinary." "Good. We will be colleagues then. In a minute or two I fancy Major Blunt will join us. He's not happy with the good mamma. Now there are some things I want to know, but I do not wish to seem to want to know them. You comprehend? So it will be your part to ask the questions." "What questions do you want me to ask?" I asked apprehensively. "I want you to introduce the name of Mrs. Ferrars." "Yes?" "Speak of her in a natural fashion. Ask him if he was down here when her husband died. You understand the kind of thing I mean. And while he replies, watch his face without seeming to watch it. C'est compris?" There was no time for more, for at that minute, as Poirot had prophesied, Blunt left the others in his abrupt fashion and came over to us. I suggested strolling on the terrace, and he acquiesced. Poirot stayed behind. I stopped to examine a late rose. "How things change in the course of a day or so," I observed. "I was up here last Wednesday, I remember, walking up and down this same terrace. Ackroyd was with me, full of spirits. And now? 3 days later, Ackroyd's dead, poor fellow. Mrs. Ferrars dead. You knew her, didn't you? But of course you did." Blunt nodded his head. "Had you seen her since you'd been down this time?" "Went with Ackroyd to call. Last Tuesday, think it was. Fascinating woman, but something queer about her. Deep. One would never know what she was up to." I looked into his steady grey eyes. Nothing there, surely. I went on. "I suppose you'd met her before?" "Last time I was here. She and her husband had just come here to live." He paused a minute and then added, "Rum thing? She had changed a lot between then and now." "How changed?" I asked. "Looked 10 years older." "Were you down here when her husband died?" I asked, trying to make the question sound as casual as possible. "No. From all I heard, it would be a good riddance. Uncharitable, perhaps, but the truth." I agreed. "Ashley Ferrars was by no means a pattern husband," I said cautiously. "Blackguard, I thought," said Blunt. "No," I said, "only a man with more money than was good for him." "Oh, money. All the troubles in the world can be put down to money, or the lack of it." "Which has been your particular trouble?" I asked. "I've enough for what I want. I'm one of the lucky ones." "Indeed." "I'm not too flush just now, as a matter of fact. Came into a legacy a year ago, and like a fool let myself be persuaded into putting it into some wild-cat scheme." I sympathized and narrated my own similar trouble. Then the gong pealed out, and we all went in to lunch. Poirot drew me back a little. "Eh, bien?" "He's all right," I said. "I'm sure of it." "Nothing disturbing?" "He had a legacy just a year ago," I said. "But why not? Why shouldn't he? I'll swear the man is perfectly square and above board." Without doubt," said Poirot soothingly. "Do not upset yourself." He spoke as though to a fractious child. We all trooped into the dining room. It seemed incredible that less than 24 hours had passed since I last sat at that table. Afterwards, Mrs. Ackroyd took me aside and sat down with me on a sofa. "I can't help feeling a little hurt," she murmured, producing a handkerchief of the kind obviously not meant to be cried into. "Hurt, I mean, by Roger's lack of confidence in me. That £20,000 ought to have been left to me, not to Flora. A mother could be trusted to safeguard the interests of her child. A lack of trust, I call it." "You forget, Mrs. Ackroyd," I said. "Flora was Ackroyd's own niece, a blood relation. It would have been different had you been his sister instead of his sister-in-law. As poor Cecil's widow, I think my feelings ought to have been considered," said the lady, touching her eyelashes gingerly with the handkerchief. "But Roger was always most peculiar, not to say mean, about money matters. It has been a most difficult position for both Flora and myself. He did not even give the poor child an allowance. He would pay her bills, you know, and even that with a good deal of reluctance and asking what she wanted all those fal-lals for, so like a man. But now I've forgotten what it was I was going to say. Oh yes, not a penny we could call our own, you know. Flora resented it. Yes, I must say she resented it, very strongly. Though devoted to her uncle, of course. But any girl would have resented it. Yes, I must say Roger had very strange ideas about money. He wouldn't even buy new face towels, though I told him the old ones were in holes. And then, proceeded Mrs. Ackroyd, with a sudden leap highly characteristic of her conversation, to leave all that money, £1,000, fancy, £1,000, to that woman. What woman? That Russell woman. Something very queer about her, and so I've always said, but Roger wouldn't hear a word against her. Said she was a woman of great force of character, and that he admired and respected her. He was always going on about her rectitude and independence and moral worth. I think there's something fishy about her. She was certainly doing her best to marry Roger, but I soon put a stop to that. She's always hated me. Naturally. I saw through her. I began to wonder if there was any chance of stemming Mrs. Ackroyd's eloquence and getting away. Mr. Hammond provided the necessary diversion by coming up to say goodbye. I seized my chance and rose also. About the inquest, I said. Where would you prefer it to be held? Here or at the Three Boars? Mrs. Ackroyd stared at me with a dropped jaw. The inquest, she asked, the picture of consternation. But surely there won't have to be an inquest. Mr. Hammond gave a dry little cough and murmured, Inevitable, under the circumstances, in two short little barks. But surely Dr. Sheppard can arrange— There are limits to my powers of arrangement, I said dryly. If his death was an accident— He was murdered, Mrs. Ackroyd, I said brutally. She gave a little cry. No theory of accident will hold water for a minute. Mrs. Ackroyd looked at me in distress. I had no patience with what I thought was her silly fear of unpleasantness. If there's an inquest, I shan't have to answer questions and all that, shall I? She asked. I don't know what will be necessary, I answered. I imagine Mr. Raymond will take the brunt of it off you. He knows all the circumstances and can give formal evidence of identification. The lawyer assented with a little bow. I really don't think there is anything to dread, Mrs. Ackroyd, he said. You will be spared all unpleasantness. Now, as to the question of money, have you all you need for the present? I mean, he added, as she looked at him inquiringly, ready money. Cash, you know. If not, I can arrange to let you have whatever you require. That ought to be all right, said Raymond, who was standing by. Mr. Ackroyd cashed a cheque for £100 yesterday. £100? Yes, for wages and other expenses due today. At the moment it is still intact. Where's this money? In his desk? No, he always kept his cash in his bedroom, in an old collar box to be accurate. Funny idea, wasn't it? I think, said the lawyer, we ought to make sure the money is there before I leave. Certainly, agreed the secretary. I'll take you up now. Oh, I forgot. The door's locked. Inquiry from Parker elicited the information that Inspector Raglan was in the housekeeper's room asking a few supplementary questions. A few minutes later, the inspector joined the party in the hall, bringing the key with him. He unlocked the door, and we passed into the lobby and up the small staircase. At the top of the stairs, the door into Ackroyd's bedroom stood open. Inside the room, it was dark. The curtains were drawn, and the bed was turned down just as it had been last night. The inspector drew the curtains, letting in the sunlight, and Geoffrey Raymond went to the top drawer of a rosewood bureau. He kept his money like that in an unlocked drawer, just fancy, commented the inspector. The secretary flushed a little. Mr. Ackroyd had perfect faith in the honesty of all the servants, he said hotly. Oh, Quite so, said the inspector hastily. Raymond opened the drawer, took out a round leather collar box from the back of it, and opening it, drew out a thick wallet. "Here is the money," he said, taking out a fat roll of notes. "You will find the 100 intact, I know, for Mr. Ackroyd put it in the collar box in my presence last night when he was dressing for dinner, and of course it has not been touched since." Mr. Hammond took the roll from him and counted it. He looked up sharply. £100, you said? But there is only 60 here. Raymond stared at him. "Impossible," he cried, springing forward. Taking the notes from the other's hand, he counted them aloud. Mr. Hammond had been right. The total amounted to £60. "But I can't understand it," cried the secretary, bewildered. Poirot asked a question. "You saw Mr. Ackroyd put this money away last night when he was dressing for dinner? You are sure he had not paid away any of it already?" "I'm sure he hadn't. He even said, 'I don't want to take £100 down to dinner with me. Too bulgy.'" "Then the affair is very simple," remarked Poirot. "Either he paid out that £40 sometime last evening, or else it has been stolen." "That's the matter in a nutshell," agreed the inspector. He turned to Mrs. Ackroyd. "Which of the servants would come in here yesterday evening?" "I suppose the housemaid would turn down the bed." "Who is she? What do you know about her?" "She's not been here very long," said Mrs. Ackroyd, "but she's a nice, ordinary country girl." "I think we ought to clear this matter up," said the inspector. "If Mr. Ackroyd paid that money away himself, it may have a bearing on the mystery of the crime. The other servants all right, as far as you know?" "Oh, I think so." "Not missed anything before?" "No. None of them leaving or anything like that?" "The parlour-maid is leaving." "When?" "She gave notice yesterday, I believe." "To you?" "Oh, no, I have nothing to do with the servants. Miss Russell attends to the household matters." The inspector remained lost in thought for a minute or two. Then he nodded his head and remarked, "I think I'd better have a word with Miss Russell, and I'll see the girl Dale as well." Poirot and I accompanied him to the housekeeper's room. Miss Russell received us with her usual sang-froid. Elsie Dale had been at Fernley 5 months, a nice girl, quick at her duties, and most respectable. Good references, the last girl in the world to take anything not belonging to her. What about the parlour-maid? She, too, was a most superior girl, very quiet and ladylike, an excellent worker. "Then why is she leaving?" asked the inspector. Miss Russell pursed up her lips. "It was none of my doing. I understand Mr. Ackroyd found fault with her yesterday afternoon. It was her duty to do the study, and she disarranged some of the papers on his desk, I believe. He was very annoyed about it, and she gave notice. At least, that is what I understood from her, but perhaps you'd like to see her yourselves." The inspector assented. I had already noticed the girl when she was waiting on us at lunch. A tall girl, with a lot of brown hair rolled tightly away at the back of her neck, and very steady grey eyes. She came in answer to the housekeeper's summons, and stood very straight, with those same grey eyes fixed on us. "You are Ursula Bourne?" asked the inspector. "Yes, sir." "I understand you are leaving." "Yes, sir." "Why is that?" "I disarranged some papers on Mr. Ackroyd's desk. He was very angry about it, and I said I had better leave. He told me to go as soon as possible." "Were you in Mr. Ackroyd's bedroom at all last night? Tidying up or anything?" "No, sir, that is Elsie's work. I never went near that part of the house." "I must tell you, my girl, that a large sum of money is missing from Mr. Ackroyd's room." At last I saw her roused. A wave of colour swept over her face. "I know nothing about any money. If you think I took it, and that is why Mr. Ackroyd dismissed me, you are wrong." "I'm not accusing you of taking it, my girl," said the inspector. "Don't flare up so." The girl looked at him coldly. "You can search my things if you like," she said disdainfully, But you won't find anything. Poirot suddenly interposed. It was yesterday afternoon that Mr. Ackroyd dismissed you, or you dismissed yourself, was it not? He asked. The girl nodded. How long did the interview last? The interview? Yes, the interview between you and Mr. Ackroyd in the study. I don't know. 20 minutes? Half an hour? Something like that. Not longer? Not longer than half an hour, certainly. Thank you, mademoiselle. I looked curiously at him. He was rearranging a few objects on the table, setting them straight with precise fingers. His eyes were shining. That'll do, said the inspector. Ursula Bourne disappeared. The inspector turned to Miss Russell. How long has she been here? Have you got a copy of the reference you had with her? Without answering the first question, Miss Russell moved to an adjacent bureau, opened one of the drawers, and took out a handful of letters clipped together with a patent fastener. She selected one and handed it to the inspector. Said he. Reads all right. Mrs. Richard Folliot, Marby Grange. Marby, who's this woman? Quite good county people, said Miss Russell. Well, said the inspector, handing it back, let's have a look at the other one, Elsie Dale. Elsie Dale was a big, fair girl, with a pleasant but slightly stupid face. She answered our questions readily enough, and showed much distress and concern at the loss of the money. I don't think there's anything wrong with her, observed the inspector, after he had dismissed her. What about Parker? Miss Russell pursed her lips together and made no reply. I've a feeling there's something wrong about that man, the inspector continued thoughtfully. The trouble is that I don't quite see when he got his opportunity. He'd be busy with his duties immediately after dinner, and he's got a pretty good alibi all through the evening, I know. For I've been devoting particular attention to it. Well, thank you very much, Miss Russell. We'll leave things as they are for the present. It's highly probable Mr. Ackroyd paid that money away himself. The housekeeper bade us a dry good afternoon, and we took our leave. I left the house with Poirot. I wonder, I said, breaking the silence, what the papers the girl disarranged could have been for Ackroyd to have got into such a state about them. I wonder if there is any clue there to the mystery. The secretary said there were no papers of particular importance on the desk, said Poirot quietly. Yes, but I paused. It strikes you as odd that Ackroyd should have flown into a rage about so trivial a matter? Yes, it does, rather. But was it a trivial matter? Of course, I admitted, we don't know what those papers may have been, but Raymond certainly said— Leave Monsieur Raymond out of it for a minute. What did you think of that girl? Which girl? The parlour-maid? Yes, the parlour-maid, Ursula Bourne. She seemed a nice girl, I said hesitatingly. Poirot repeated my words, but whereas I had laid a slight stress on the fourth word, he put it on the second. She seemed a nice girl, yes. Then, after a minute's silence, he took something from his pocket and handed it to me. See, my friend, I will show you something. Look there. The paper he had handed me was that compiled by the inspector and given by him to Poirot that morning. Following the pointing finger, I saw a small cross marked in pencil opposite the name Ursula Bourne. You may not have noticed it at the time, my good friend, but there was one person on this list whose alibi had no kind of confirmation. Ursula Bourne. You don't think— Dr. Sheppard, I dare to think anything. Ursula Bourne may have killed Mr. Ackroyd, but I confess I can see no motive for her doing so. Can you? He looked at me very hard, so hard that I felt uncomfortable. Can you? He repeated. No motive whatsoever, I said firmly. His gaze relaxed. He frowned and murmured to himself. Since the blackmailer was a man, it follows that she cannot be the blackmailer, then— I coughed. As far as that goes? I began doubtfully. He spun round on me. What? What are you going to say? Nothing. Only that Strictly speaking, Mrs. Ferrars in her letter mentioned a person. She didn't actually specify a man, but we took it for granted, Ackroyd and I, that it was a man. Poirot did not seem to be listening to me. He was muttering to himself again. But then, it is possible after all. Yes, certainly it is possible, but then I must rearrange my ideas. Method, order, never have I needed them more. Everything must fit in its appointed place, otherwise I am on the wrong tack. He broke off and whirled round upon me again. Where is Marby? It's on the other side of Cranchester. How far away? Oh, 14 miles, perhaps. Would it be possible for you to go there tomorrow, say? Tomorrow? Let me see, that's Sunday. Yes, I could arrange it. What do you want me to do there? See this Mrs. Folliot. Find out all you can about Ursula Bourne. Very well, but I don't much care for the job. It is not the time to make difficulties. A man's life may hang on this. Poor Ralph, I said with a sigh. You believe him to be innocent, though? Poirot looked at me very gravely. Do you want to know the truth? Of course. Then you shall have it. My friend, everything points to the assumption that he is guilty. What? I exclaimed. Poirot nodded. Yes, that stupid inspector, for he is stupid, has everything pointing his way. I seek for the truth, and the truth leads me every time to Ralph Paton. Motive, opportunity, means. But I will leave no stone unturned, I promised Mademoiselle Flora, and she was very sure, that little one. But very sure indeed. Chapter 11. Poirot pays a call. I was slightly nervous when I rang the bell at Marby Grange the following afternoon. I wondered very much what Poirot expected to find out. He had entrusted the job to me. Why? Was it because, as in the case of questioning Major Blunt, he wished to remain in the background? The wish, intelligible in the first case, seemed to me quite meaningless here. My meditations were interrupted by the advent of a smart parlour-maid. Yes, Mrs. Folliot was at home. I was ushered into a big drawing-room and looked round me curiously as I waited for the mistress of the house. A large, bare room, some good bits of old china, and some beautiful etchings, shabby covers and curtains. A lady's room in every sense of the term. I turned from the inspection of a Bartolozzi on the wall as Mrs. Folliot came into the room. She was a tall woman with untidy brown hair and a very winning smile. Dr. Sheppard, she said hesitatingly. That is my name, I replied. I must apologize for calling upon you like this, but I wanted some information about a parlour-maid previously employed by you, Ursula Bourne. With the utterance of the name, the smile vanished from her face, and all the cordiality froze out of her manner. She looked uncomfortable and ill at ease. Ursula Bourne? She said, hesitatingly. Yes, I said. Perhaps you don't remember the name. Oh, yes, of course, I remember perfectly. She left you just over a year ago, I understand. Yes, she did. That is quite right. And you were satisfied with her whilst she was with you? How long was she with you, by the way? Oh, a year or two. I can't remember exactly how long. She is very capable. I'm sure you will find her quite satisfactory. I didn't know she was leaving Fernley. I hadn't the least idea of it. Can you tell me anything about her? I asked. Anything about her? Yes. Where she comes from, who her people are, that sort of thing. Mrs. Folliot's face wore more than ever its frozen look. I don't know at all. Who was she with before she came to you? I'm afraid I don't remember. There was a spark of anger now underlying her nervousness. She flung up her head in a gesture that was vaguely familiar. Is it really necessary to ask all these questions? Not at all, I said, with an air of surprise and a tinge of apology in my manner. I had no idea you would mind answering them. I am very sorry. Her anger left her and she became confused again. Oh, I don't mind answering them. I assure you I don't. Why should I? It just seemed a little odd, you know, that's all. A little odd. One advantage of being a medical practitioner is that you can usually tell when people are lying to you. I should have known from Mrs. Folliot's manner, if from nothing else, that she did mind answering my questions, minded intensely. She was thoroughly uncomfortable and upset, and there was plainly some mystery in the background. I judged her to be a woman quite unused to deception of any kind, and consequently rendered acutely uneasy when forced to practice it. A child could have seen through her. But it was also clear that she had no intention of telling me anything further. Whatever the mystery centering around Ursula Bourne might be, I was not going to learn it through Mrs. Folliot. Defeated, I apologized once more for disturbing her, took my hat, and departed. I went to see a couple of patients and arrived home about 6 o'clock. Caroline was sitting beside the wreck of tea things. She had that look of suppressed exultation on her face which I know only too well. It is a sure sign with her of either the getting or the giving of information. I wondered which it had been. "I've had a very interesting afternoon," began Caroline, as I dropped into my own particular easy chair and stretched out my feet to the inviting blaze in the fireplace. "Have you?" I asked. "Miss Gannett drop in to tea?" Miss Gannett is one of the chief of our newsmongers. "Guess again," said Caroline with intense complacency. I guessed several times, working slowly through all the members of Caroline's intelligence corps. My sister received each guess with a triumphant shake of the head. In the end, she volunteered the information herself. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. "Now what do you think of that?" I thought a good many things of it, but I was careful not to say them to Caroline. "Why did he come?" I asked. "To see me, of course. He said that knowing my brother so well, he hoped he might be permitted to make the acquaintance of his charming sister. Your charming sister. I've got mixed up. But you know what I mean." "What did he talk about?" I asked. "He told me a lot about himself and his cases. You know that Prince Paul of Mauritania, the one who's just married a dancer?" "Yes?" "I saw a most intriguing paragraph about her in Society Snippets the other day, hinting that she was really a Russian Grand Duchess, one of the Tsar's daughters who managed to escape from the Bolsheviks. Well, it seems that Monsieur Poirot solved a baffling murder mystery that threatened to involve them both. Prince Paul was beside himself with gratitude." "Did he give him an emerald tie-pin the size of a plover's egg?" I inquired sarcastically. "He didn't mention it. Why?" "Nothing," I said. "I thought it was always done. It is in detective fiction anyway. The super-detective always has his rooms littered with rubies and pearls and emeralds from grateful royal clients. And then it's very interesting to hear about these things from the inside," said my sister complacently. "It would be to Caroline." I could not but admire the ingenuity of Monsieur Hercule Poirot, who had selected unerringly the case of all others that would most appeal to an elderly maiden lady living in a small village. "Did he tell you if the dancer was really a Grand Duchess?" I inquired. "He was not at liberty to speak," said Caroline importantly. I wondered how far Poirot had strained the truth in talking to Caroline. Probably not at all. He had conveyed his innuendos by means of his eyebrows and his shoulders. "And after all this," I remarked, "I suppose you were ready to eat out of his hand." "Don't be coarse, James. I don't know where you get these vulgar expressions from." "Probably from my only link with the outside world, my patients. Unfortunately, my practice does not lie amongst royal princes and interesting Russian émigrés." Caroline pushed her spectacles up and looked at me. "You seem very grumpy, James. It must be your liver. A blue pill, I think, tonight." To see me in my own home, you would never imagine that I was a doctor of medicine. Caroline does the home prescribing both for herself and me. "Damn my liver," I said irritably. "Did you talk about the murder at all?" "Well, naturally, James. What else is there to talk about locally? I was able to set Monsieur Poirot right upon several points. He was very grateful to me. He said I had the makings of a born detective in me and a wonderful psychological insight into human nature. Caroline was exactly like a cat that is full to overflowing with rich cream. She was positively purring. He talked a lot about the little grey cells of the brain and of their functions. His own, he says, are of the first quality. He would say so, I remarked bitterly. Modesty is certainly not his middle name. I wish you would not be so horribly American, James. He thought it very important that Ralph should be found as soon as possible and induced to come forward and give an account of himself. He says that his disappearance will produce a very unfortunate impression at the inquest. And what did you say to that? I agreed with him, said Caroline importantly, and I was able to tell him the way people were already talking about it. Caroline, I said sharply, did you tell Monsieur Poirot what you overheard in the wood that day? I did, said Caroline complacently. I got up and began to walk about. You realize what you're doing, I hope, I jerked out. You're putting a halter round Ralph Peyton's neck as surely as you're sitting in that chair. Not at all, said Caroline, quite unruffled. I was surprised you hadn't told him. I took very good care not to, I said. I'm fond of that boy. So am I. That's why I say you're talking nonsense. I don't believe Ralph did it, and so the truth can't hurt him, and we ought to give Monsieur Poirot all the help we can. Why think? Very likely Ralph was out with that identical girl on the night of the murder, and if so, he's got a perfect alibi. If he's got a perfect alibi, I retorted, why doesn't he come forward and say so? Might get the girl into trouble, said Caroline sapiently. But if Monsieur Poirot gets hold of her and puts it to her as her duty, she'll come forward of her own accord and clear Ralph. You seem to have invented a romantic fairy story of your own, I said. You read too many trashy novels, Caroline. I've always told you so. I dropped into my chair again. Did Poirot ask you any more questions? I inquired. Only about the patients you had that morning. The patients? I demanded unbelievingly. Yes, your surgery patients. How many and who they were. Do you mean to say you were able to tell him that? I demanded. Caroline is really amazing. Why not? Asked my sister triumphantly. I can see the path up to the surgery door perfectly from this window, and I've got an excellent memory, James. Much better than yours, let me tell you. I'm sure you have, I murmured mechanically. My sister went on, checking the names on her fingers. There was old Mrs. Bennet, and that boy from the farm with the bad finger, Dolly Grice, to have a needle out of her finger, that American steward off the liner. Let me see. That's 4. Yes, and old George Evans with his ulcer. And lastly... She paused significantly. Well? Caroline brought out her climax triumphantly. She hissed in the most approved style, aided by the fortunate number of S's at her disposal. Miss Russell? She sat back in her chair and looked at me meaningly. And when Caroline looks at you meaningly, it is impossible to miss it. I don't know what you mean, I said, quite untruthfully. Why shouldn't Miss Russell consult me about her bad knee? Bad knee, said Caroline. Fiddlesticks. No more bad knee than you and I. She was after something else. What? I asked. Caroline had to admit that she didn't know. But depend upon it. That was what he was trying to get at, Monsieur Poirot, I mean. There's something fishy about that woman, and he knows it. Precisely the remark Mrs. Ackroyd made to me yesterday, I said, that there was something fishy about Miss Russell. Ah, said Caroline darkly, Mrs. Ackroyd. There's another. Another what? Caroline refused to explain her remarks. She merely nodded her head several times, rolled up her knitting, and went upstairs to don the high mauve silk blouse and the gold locket which she calls dressing for dinner. I stayed there, staring into the fire and thinking over Caroline's words. Had Poirot really come to gain information about Miss Russell? Or was it only Caroline's tortuous mind that interpreted everything according to her own ideas? And there had certainly been nothing in Miss Russell's manner that morning to arouse suspicion. At least, I remembered her persistent conversation on the subject of drug-taking, and from that she had led the conversation to poisons and poisoning. But there was nothing in that. Ackroyd had not been poisoned. Still, it was odd. I heard Caroline's voice, rather acid in note, calling from the top of the stairs. "James, you will be late for dinner." I put some coal on the fire and went upstairs obediently. It is well at any price to have peace in the home. Chapter 12. Round the Table. A joint inquest was held on Monday. I do not propose to give the proceedings in detail. To do so would only be to go over the same ground again and again. By arrangement with the police, very little was allowed to come out. I gave evidence as to the cause of Ackroyd's death and the probable time. The absence of Ralph Peyton was commented on by the coroner, but not unduly stressed. Afterwards, Poirot and I had a few words with Inspector Raglan. The inspector was very grave. "It looks bad, Mr. Poirot," he said. "I'm trying to judge the thing fair and square. I'm a local man, and I've seen Captain Peyton many times in Cranchester. I'm not wanting him to be the guilty one, but it's bad whichever way you look at it. If he's innocent, why doesn't he come forward? We've got evidence against him, but it's just possible that that evidence could be explained away. Then why doesn't he give an explanation?" A lot more lay behind the inspector's words than I knew at the time. Ralph's description had been wired to every port and railway station in England. The police everywhere were on the alert. His rooms in town were watched, and any houses he had been known to be in the habit of frequenting. With such a cordon, it seemed impossible that Ralph should be able to evade detection. He had no luggage, and, as far as anyone knew, no money. "I can't find anyone who saw him at the station that night," continued the inspector, "and yet he's well known down here, and you'd think somebody would have noticed him. There's no news from Liverpool either." "You think he went to Liverpool?" queried Poirot. "Well, it's on the cards. That telephone message from the station, just 3 minutes before the Liverpool Express left. There ought to be something in that." "Unless it was deliberately intended to throw you off the scent, that might just possibly be the point of the telephone message." "That's an idea," said the inspector eagerly. "Do you really think that's the explanation of the telephone call?" "My friend," said Poirot gravely, "I do not know. But I will tell you this. I believe that when we find the explanation of that telephone call, we shall find the explanation of the murder." "You said something like that before, I remember," I observed, looking at him curiously. Poirot nodded. "I always come back to it," he said seriously. "It seems to me utterly irrelevant," I declared. "I wouldn't say that," demurred the inspector, "but I must confess I think Mr. Poirot here harps on it a little too much. We've better clues than that. The fingerprints on the dagger, for instance." Poirot became suddenly very foreign in manner, as he often did when excited over anything. "Monsieur l'Inspecteur," he said, "beware of the blind, comment dire, the little street that has no end to it." Inspector Raglan stared, but I was quicker. "You mean a blind alley?" I said. "That is it, the blind street that leads nowhere. So it may be with those fingerprints. They may lead you nowhere." "I don't see how that can well be," said the police officer. "I suppose you're hinting that they're faked? I've read of such things being done, though I can't say I've ever come across it in my experience. But fake or true, they're bound to lead somewhere." Poirot merely shrugged his shoulders, flinging out his arms wide. The inspector then showed us various enlarged photographs of the fingerprints, and proceeded to become technical on the subject of loops and whorls. "Come now," he said at last, annoyed by Poirot's detached manner. "You've got to admit that those prints were made by someone who was in the house that night?" "Bien entendu," said Poirot, nodding his head. "Well, I've taken the prints of every member of the household, everyone, mind you, from the old lady down to the kitchen maid. I don't think Mrs. Ackroyd would enjoy being referred to as the old lady. She must spend a considerable amount on cosmetics. Everyone's, repeated the inspector fussily. Including mine, I said dryly. Very well, none of them correspond. That leaves us two alternatives. Ralph Peyton or the mysterious stranger the doctor here tells us about. When we get hold of those two— Much valuable time may have been lost, broke in Poirot. I don't quite get you, Mr. Poirot. You have taken the prints of everyone in the house, you say, murmured Poirot. Is that the exact truth you are telling me there, Monsieur l'Inspecteur? Certainly. Without overlooking anyone? Without overlooking anyone? The quick or the dead? For a moment, the inspector looked bewildered at what he took to be a religious observation. Then he reacted slowly. You mean— The dead, Monsieur l'Inspecteur. The inspector still took a minute or two to understand. I am suggesting, said Poirot placidly, that the fingerprints on the dagger handle are those of Mr. Ackroyd himself. It is an easy matter to verify. His body is still available. But why? What would be the point of it? You're surely not suggesting suicide, Mr. Poirot? Ah, no. My theory is that the murderer wore gloves or wrapped something round his hand. After the blow was struck, he picked up the victim's hand and closed it round the dagger handle. But why? Poirot shrugged his shoulders again. To make a confusing case even more confusing. Well, said the inspector, I'll look into it. What gave you the idea in the first place? When you were so kind as to show me the dagger and draw attention to the fingerprints, I know very little of loops and whirls. See, I confess my ignorance frankly. But it did occur to me that the position of the prints was somewhat awkward. Not so would I have held a dagger in order to strike. Naturally, with the right hand brought up over the shoulder backwards, it would have been difficult to put it in exactly the right position. Inspector Raglan stared at the little man. Poirot, with an air of great unconcern, flecked a speck of dust from his coat sleeve. Well, said the inspector, it's an idea. I'll look into it all right, but don't you be disappointed if nothing comes of it. He endeavoured to make his tone kindly and patronizing. Poirot watched him go off. Then he turned to me with twinkling eyes. Another time, he observed, I must be more careful of his amour-propre. And now that we are left to our own devices, what do you think, my good friend, of a little reunion of the family? The little reunion, as Poirot called it, took place about half an hour later. We sat round the table in the dining-room at Fernley, Poirot at the head of the table, like the chairman of some ghastly board meeting. The servants were not present, so we were 6 in all. Mrs. Ackroyd, Flora, Major Blunt, young Raymond, Poirot, and myself. When everyone was assembled, Poirot rose and bowed. Messieurs, mesdames, I have called you together for a certain purpose. He paused. To begin with, I want to make a very special plea to Mademoiselle. To me, said Flora. Mademoiselle, you are engaged to Captain Ralph Patton. If anyone is in his confidence, you are. I beg you, most earnestly, if you know of his whereabouts, to persuade him to come forward. 1 little minute, as Flora raised her head to speak. Say nothing till you have well reflected. Mademoiselle, his position grows daily more dangerous. If he had come forward at once, no matter how damning the facts, he might have had a chance of explaining them away. But this silence, this flight, what can it mean? Surely only one thing, knowledge of guilt. Mademoiselle, if you really believe in his innocence, persuade him to come forward before it is too late. Flora's face had gone very white. Too late, she repeated, very low. Poirot leant forward looking at her. See now, mademoiselle, he said very gently. It is Papa Poirot who asks you this. The old Papa Poirot who has much knowledge and much experience. I would not seek to entrap you, mademoiselle. Will you not trust me, and tell me where Ralph Patton is hiding? The girl rose and stood facing him. Monsieur Poirot, she said in a clear voice, I swear to you, swear solemnly, that I have no idea where Ralph is, and that I have neither seen him nor heard from him either on the day of the murder or since. She sat down again. Poirot gazed at her in silence for a minute or two. Then he brought his hand down on the table with a sharp rap. Bien, that is that, he said. His face hardened. Now I appeal to these others who sit round this table, Mrs. Ackroyd, Major Blunt, Dr. Sheppard, Mr. Raymond. You are all friends and intimates of the missing man. If you know where Ralph Patten is hiding, speak out. There was a long silence. Poirot looked to each in turn. I beg of you, he said in a low voice, speak out. But still there was silence, broken at last by Mrs. Ackroyd. I must say, she observed in a plaintive voice, that Ralph's absence is most peculiar indeed, not to come forward at such a time. It looks, you know, as though there was something behind it. I can't help thinking, Flora dear, that it was a very fortunate thing your engagement was never formally announced. Mother, cried Flora angrily. Providence, declared Mrs. Ackroyd. I have a devout belief in Providence, a divinity that shapes our ends, as Shakespeare's beautiful line runs. Surely you don't make the Almighty directly responsible for thick ankles, Mrs. Ackroyd, do you? Asked Geoffrey Raymond, his irresponsible laugh ringing out. His idea was, I think, to loosen the tension, but Mrs. Ackroyd threw him a glance of reproach and took out her handkerchief. Flora has been saved a terrible amount of notoriety and unpleasantness. Not for a moment that I think dear Ralph had anything to do with poor Roger's death. I don't think so, but then I have a trusting heart. I always have had ever since a child. I am loath to believe the worst of anyone. But of course one must remember that Ralph was in several air raids as a young boy. The results are apparent long after, sometimes, they say. People are not responsible for their actions in the least. They lose control, you know, without being able to help it. Mother, cried Flora, you don't think Ralph did it? Come, Mrs. Ackroyd, said Blunt. I don't know what to think, said Mrs. Ackroyd tearfully. It's all very upsetting. What would happen to the estate, I wonder, if Ralph were found guilty? Raymond pushed his chair away from the table violently. Major Blunt remained very quiet, looking thoughtfully at her. Like shell shock, you know, said Mrs. Ackroyd obstinately, and I dare say Roger kept him very short of money. With the best intentions, of course. I can see you are all against me, but I do think it is very odd that Ralph has not come forward, and I must say I am thankful Flora's engagement was never announced formally. It will be tomorrow, said Flora in a clear voice. Flora! Cried her mother, aghast. Flora had turned to the secretary. No. Will you send the announcement to the Morning Post and the Times, please, Mr. Raymond? If you are sure that it is wise, Miss Ackroyd, he replied gravely. She turned impulsively to Blunt. You understand, she said. What else can I do? As things are, I must stand by Ralph. Don't you see that I must? She looked very searchingly at him, and after a long pause, he nodded abruptly. Mrs. Ackroyd burst out into shrill protests. Flora remained unmoved. Then Raymond spoke. I appreciate your motives, Miss Ackroyd, but don't you think you're being rather precipitate? Wait a day or two. Tomorrow, said Flora in a clear voice. It's no good, Mother, going on like this. Whatever else I am, I'm not disloyal to my friends. Monsieur Poirot, Mrs. Ackroyd appealed tearfully, can't you say anything at all? Nothing to be said, interpolated Blunt. She's doing the right thing. I'll stand by her through thick and thin. Flora held out her hand to him. Thank you, Major Blunt, she said. Mademoiselle, said Poirot, will you let an old man congratulate you on your courage and your loyalty? And will you not misunderstand me if I ask you most solemnly, to postpone the announcement you speak of for at least 2 days more? Flora hesitated. "I ask it in Ralph Peyton's interests as much as in yours, mademoiselle. You frown. You do not see how that can be, but I assure you that it is so. Pas de blague. You put the case into my hands. You must not hamper me now." Flora paused a few minutes before replying. "I do not like it," she said at last, "but I will do what you say." She sat down again at the table. "And now, Messieurs et Mesdames," said Poirot rapidly, "I will continue with what I was about to say. Understand this, I mean to arrive at the truth. The truth, however ugly in itself, is always curious and beautiful to the seeker after it. I am much aged. My powers may not be what they were." Here he clearly expected a contradiction. "In all probability, this is the last case I shall ever investigate. But Hercule, Poirot does not end with a failure. Messieurs et Mesdames, I tell you, I mean to know. And I shall know, in spite of you all." He brought out the last words provocatively, hurling them in our face as it were. I think we all flinched back a little, excepting Geoffrey Raymond, who remained good-humoured and imperturbable as usual. "How do you mean, in spite of us all?" he asked, with slightly raised eyebrows. "But just that, monsieur. Every one of you in this room is concealing something from me." He raised his hand as a faint murmur of protest arose. Yes, I know what I'm saying. It may be something unimportant, trivial, which is supposed to have no bearing on the case, but there it is. Each one of you has something to hide. Come, now, am I right?" His glance, challenging and accusing, swept round the table, and every pair of eyes dropped before his. Yes, mine as well. "I am answered," said Poirot with a curious laugh. He got up from his seat. "I appeal to you all. Tell me the truth, the whole truth." There was a silence. "Will no one speak?" He gave the same short laugh again. "C'est dommage," he said, and went out. Chapter 13. The Goose Quill. That evening, at Poirot's request, I went over to his house after dinner. Caroline saw me depart with visible reluctance. I think she would have liked to have accompanied me. Poirot greeted me hospitably. He had placed a bottle of Irish whiskey, which I detest, on a small table with a soda-water siphon and a glass. He himself was engaged in brewing hot chocolate. It was a favourite beverage of his, I discovered later. He inquired politely after my sister, whom he declared to be a most interesting woman. "I'm afraid you've been giving her a swelled head," I said dryly. "What about Sunday afternoon?" He laughed and twinkled. "I always like to employ the expert," he remarked obscurely. But he refused to explain the remark. "You got all the local gossip anyway," I remarked, "true and untrue." "And a great deal of valuable information," he added quietly. "Such as—" He shook his head. "Why not have told me the truth?" he countered. "In a place like this, all Ralph Peyton's doings were bound to be known. If your sister had not happened to pass through the wood that day, somebody else would have done so?" "I suppose they would," I said grumpily. "What about this interest of yours in my patients?" Again he twinkled. "Only one of them, Doctor. Only one of them." "The last?" I hazarded. "I find Miss Russell a study of the most interesting," he said evasively. "Do you agree with my sister and Mrs. Ackroyd that there is something fishy about her?" I asked. "Eh? What do you say, fishy?" I explained to the best of my ability. "And they say that, do they?" "Didn't my sister convey as much to you yesterday afternoon?" "C'est possible." "For no reason whatever," I declared. "Les femmes," generalized Poirot, "they are marvelous. They invent haphazard, and by miracle they are right. Not that it is that, really. Women observe subconsciously 1,000 little details without knowing that they are doing so. Their subconscious mind adds these little things together, and they call the result intuition. Me, I am very skilled in psychology. I know these things." He swelled his chest out importantly, looking so ridiculous that I found it difficult not to burst out laughing. Then he took a small sip of his chocolate and carefully wiped his mustache. "I wish you'd tell me," I burst out, "what you really think of it all." He put down his cup. "You wish that?" "I do. You have seen what I have seen. Should not our ideas be the same?" "I'm afraid you're laughing at me," I said stiffly. "Of course, I've no experience of matters of this kind." Poirot smiled at me indulgently. "You are like the little child who wants to know the way the engine works. You wish to see the affair, not as the family doctor sees it, but with the eye of a detective who knows and cares for no one, to whom they are all strangers and all equally liable to suspicion." "You put it very well," I said. "So I give you, then, a little lecture. The first thing is to get a clear history of what happened that evening, always bearing in mind that the person who speaks may be lying." I raised my eyebrows. Rather a suspicious attitude. "But necessary, I assure you. Necessary. Now, first, Dr. Sheppard leaves the house at 10 minutes to 9. How do I know that? Because I told you so. But you might not be speaking the truth, or the watch you went by might be wrong. But Parker also says that you left the house at 10 minutes to 9, so we accept that statement and pass on. At 9 o'clock you run into a man, and here we come to what we will call the romance of the mysterious stranger just outside the park gates. How do I know that that is so?" "I told you so," I began again, but Poirot interrupted me with a gesture of impatience. "Ah, but it is that you are a little stupid tonight, my friend. You know that it is so, but how am I to know? Eh bien, I am able to tell you that the mysterious stranger was not a hallucination on your part, because the maid of a Miss Gannett met him a few minutes before you did, and of her, too, he inquired the way to Fernley Park. We accept his presence, therefore, and we can be fairly sure of two things about him: that he was a stranger to the neighbourhood, and that whatever his object in going to Fernley, there was no great secrecy about it, since he twice asked the way there." "Yes," I said, "I see that. Now I have made it my business to find out more about this man. He had a drink at the Three Boars, I learn, and the barmaid there says that he spoke with an American accent and mentioned having just come over from the States. Did it strike you that he had an American accent?" "Yes, I think he had," I said after a minute or two, during which I cast my mind back, "but a very slight one." "Precisement. There is also this, which, you will remember, I picked up in the summer house." He held out to me the little quill. I looked at it curiously. Then a memory of something I had read stirred in me. Poirot, who had been watching my face, nodded. "Yes, heroines know. Drug takers carry it like this and sniff it up the nose." "Diamorphine hydrochloride," I murmured mechanically. "This method of taking the drug is very common on the other side. Another proof, if we wanted one, that the man came from Canada or the States." "What first attracted your attention to that summer house?" I asked curiously. My friend the inspector took it for granted that anyone using that path did so as a shortcut to the house. But as soon as I saw the summer house, I realized that the same path would be taken by anyone using the summer house as a rendezvous. Now it seems fairly certain that the stranger came neither to the front nor to the back door. Then did someone from the house go out and meet him? If so, what could be a more convenient place than that little summer house? I searched it with the hope that I might find some clue inside. I found two, the scrap of cambric and the quill. "And the scrap of cambric?" I asked curiously. "What about that?" Poirot raised his eyebrows. "You do not use your little grey cells," he remarked dryly. "The scrap of starched cambric should be obvious." "Not very obvious to me." I changed the subject. "Anyway," I said, "this man went to the summer house to meet somebody. Who was that somebody?" "Exactly the question," said Poirot. "You will remember that Mrs. Ackroyd and her daughter came over from Canada to live here. Is that what you meant today when you accused them of hiding the truth?" "Perhaps. Now another point. What did you think of the parlour-maid's story?" What story? The story of her dismissal? Does it take half an hour to dismiss a servant? Was the story of those important papers a likely one? And remember, though she says she was in her bedroom from 9:30 until 10 o'clock, there is no one to confirm her statement. You bewilder me, I said. To me, it grows clearer. But tell me now your own ideas and theories. I drew a piece of paper from my pocket. I just scribbled down a few suggestions, I said apologetically. But excellent. You have method. Let us hear them. I read out in a somewhat embarrassed voice. To begin with, one must look at the thing logically. Just what my poor Hastings used to say, interrupted Poirot, but alas, he never did so. Point no. 1. Mr. Ackroyd was heard talking to someone at 9:30. Point no. 2. At some time during the evening, Ralph Peyton must have come in through the window, as evidenced by the prints of his shoes. Point no. 3. Mr. Ackroyd was nervous that evening and would only have admitted someone he knew. Point no. 4. The person with Mr. Ackroyd at 9:30 was asking for money. We know Ralph Peyton was in a scrape. These 4 points go to show that the person with Mr. Ackroyd at 9:30 was Ralph Peyton. But we know that Mr. Ackroyd was alive at 9:45. Therefore it was not Ralph who killed him. Ralph left the window open. Afterwards the murderer came in that way. And who was the murderer? Inquired Poirot. The American stranger. He may have been in league with Parker, and possibly in Parker we have the man who blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars. If so, Parker may have heard enough to realize the game was up, have told his accomplice so, and the latter did the crime with the dagger which Parker gave him. It is a theory that, admitted Poirot, decidedly you have cells of a kind, but it leaves a good deal unaccounted for. Such as, the telephone call, the pushed-out chair. Do you really think the latter important? I interrupted. Perhaps not, admitted my friend. It may have been pulled out by accident, and Raymond or Blunt may have shoved it into place unconsciously under the stress of emotion. Then there is the missing £40. Given by Ackroyd to Ralph, I suggested. He may have reconsidered his first refusal. That still leaves one thing unexplained. What? Why was Blunt so certain in his own mind that it was Raymond with Mr. Ackroyd at 9:30? He explained that, I said. You think so? I will not press the point. Tell me instead what were Ralph Peyton's reasons for disappearing? That's rather more difficult, I said slowly. I shall have to speak as a medical man. Ralph's nerves must have gone foot if he suddenly found out that his uncle had been murdered within a few minutes. Of his leaving him, after perhaps a rather stormy interview, well, he might get the wind up and clear right out. Men have been known to do that, act guiltily when they're perfectly innocent. Yes, that is true, said Poirot, but we must not lose sight of one thing. I know what you're going to say, I remarked. Motive. Ralph Paton inherits a great fortune by his uncle's death. That is one motive, agreed Poirot. One? My oui. Do you realize that there are 3 separate motives staring us in the face? Somebody certainly stole the blue envelope and its contents. That is one motive. Blackmail. Ralph Paton may have been the man who blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars. Remember, as far as Hammond knew, Ralph Peyton had not applied to his uncle for help of late. That looks as though he were being supplied with money elsewhere. Then there is the fact that he was in some, how do you say, scrape, which he feared might get to his uncle's ears. And finally, there is the one you have just mentioned. Dear me, I said, rather taken aback. The case does seem black against him. Does it? Said Poirot. That is where we disagree, you and I. 3 motives, it is almost too much. I'm inclined to believe that, after all, Ralph Paton is innocent. Chapter 14. Mrs. Ackroyd. After the evening talk I have just chronicled, the affair seemed to me to enter on a different phase. The whole thing can be divided into two parts, each clear and distinct from the other. Part 1 ranges from Ackroyd's death on the Friday evening to the following Monday night. It is the straightforward narrative of what occurred as presented to Hercule Poirot. I was at Poirot's elbow the whole time. I saw what he saw. I tried my best to read his mind. As I know now, I failed in this latter task. Though Poirot showed me all his discoveries, as for instance the gold wedding ring, he held back the vital and yet logical impressions that he formed. As I came to know later, this secrecy was characteristic of him. He would throw out hints and suggestions, but beyond that, he would not go. As I say, up till the Monday evening, my narrative might have been that of Poirot himself. I played Watson to his Sherlock, but after Monday, our ways diverged. Poirot was busy on his own account. I got to hear of what he was doing, because in King's Abbot you get to hear of everything, but he did not take me into his confidence beforehand. And I, too, had my own preoccupations. On looking back, the thing that strikes me most is the piecemeal character of this period. Everyone had a hand in the elucidation of the mystery. It was rather like a jigsaw puzzle to which everyone contributed their own little piece of knowledge or discovery. But their task ended there. To Poirot alone belongs the renown of fitting those pieces into their correct place. Some of the incidents seemed at the time irrelevant and unmeaning. There was, for instance, the question of the black boots. But that comes later. To take things strictly in chronological order, I must begin with the summons from Mrs. Ackroyd. She sent for me early on Tuesday morning, and since the summons sounded an urgent one, I hastened there, expecting to find her in extremis. The lady was in bed. So much did she concede to the etiquette of the situation. She gave me her bony hand and indicated a chair drawn up to the bedside. "Well, Mrs. Ackroyd," I said, "and what's the matter with you?" I spoke with that kind of spurious geniality which seems to be expected of general practitioners. "I'm prostrated," said Mrs. Ackroyd in a faint voice. "Absolutely prostrated. It's the shock of poor Roger's death. They say these things often aren't felt at the time, you know. It's the reaction afterwards. It is a pity that a doctor is precluded by his profession from being able sometimes to say what he really thinks. I would have given anything to be able to answer, 'Bunkum.' Instead, I suggested a tonic. Mrs. Ackroyd accepted the tonic. One move in the game seemed now to be concluded. Not for a moment did I imagine that I had been sent for because of the shock occasioned by Ackroyd's death. But Mrs. Ackroyd is totally incapable of pursuing a straightforward course on any subject. She always approaches her object by tortuous means. I wondered very much why it was she had sent for me. And then that scene. "Yesterday," continued my patient. She paused as though expecting me to take up a cue. "What scene?" "Doctor, how can you? Have you forgotten? That dreadful little Frenchman or Belgian or whatever he is, bullying us all like he did. It has quite upset me, coming on top of Roger's death." "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Ackroyd," I said. "I don't know what he meant, shouting at us like he did. I should hope I know my duty too well to dream of concealing anything. I have given the police every assistance in my power." Mrs. Ackroyd paused, and I said, "Quite so." I was beginning to have a glimmering of what all the trouble was about. "No one can say that I have failed in my duty," continued Mrs. Ackroyd. "I am sure Inspector Raglan is perfectly satisfied. Why should this little upstart of a foreigner make a fuss? A most ridiculous-looking creature he is, too, just like a comic Frenchman in a review. I can't think why Flora insisted on bringing him into the case. She never said a word to me about it, just went off and did it on her own. Flora is too independent. I am a woman of the world and her mother. She should have come to me for advice first." I listened to all this in silence. What does he think? That's what I want to know. Does he actually imagine I'm hiding something? He positively accused me yesterday. I shrugged my shoulders. It is surely of no consequence, Mrs. Ackroyd, I said. Since you are not concealing anything, any remarks he may have made do not apply to you. Mrs. Ackroyd went off at a tangent after her usual fashion. Servants are so tiresome, she said. They gossip and talk amongst themselves, and then it gets round, and all the time there's probably nothing in it at all. Have the servants been talking? I asked. What about? Mrs. Ackroyd cast a very shrewd glance at me. It quite threw me off my balance. I was sure you'd know, Doctor, if anyone did. You were with Monsieur Poirot all the time, weren't you? I was. Then of course you know. It was that girl, Ursula Bourne, wasn't it? Naturally, she's leaving. She would want to make all the trouble she could. Spiteful, that's what they are. They're all alike. Now, you being there, Doctor, you must know exactly what she did say. I'm most anxious that no wrong impression should get about. After all, you don't repeat every little detail to the police, do you? There are family matters sometimes, nothing to do with the question of the murder. But if the girl was spiteful, she may have made out all sorts of things. I was shrewd enough to see that a very real anxiety lay behind these outpourings. Poirot had been justified in his premises. Of the 6 people round the table yesterday, Mrs. Ackroyd at least had had something to hide. It was for me to discover what that something might be. If I were you, Mrs. Ackroyd, I said brusquely, I should make a clean breast of things. She gave a little scream. Oh, Doctor, how can you be so abrupt? It sounds as though, and I can explain everything so simply. Then why not do so? I suggested. Mrs. Ackroyd took out a frilled handkerchief and became tearful. I thought, Doctor, that you might put it to Monsieur Poirot. Explain it, you know, because it's so difficult for a foreigner to see our point of view. And you don't know, nobody could know, what I've had to contend with. A martyrdom, a long martyrdom. That's what my life has been. I don't like to speak ill of the dead, but there it is. Not the smallest bill, but it had all to be gone over, just as though Roger had had a few miserly hundreds a year instead of being, as Mr. Hammond told me yesterday, one of the wealthiest men in these parts. Mrs. Ackroyd paused to dab her eyes with the frilled handkerchief. Yes, I said encouragingly. You were talking about bills? Those dreadful bills. And some I didn't like to show Roger at all. They were things a man wouldn't understand. He would have said the things weren't necessary, and of course they mounted up, you know, and they kept coming in. She looked at me appealingly, as though asking me to condole with her on this striking peculiarity. It's a habit they have, I agreed, and the tone altered, became quite abusive. I assure you, Doctor, I was becoming a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep at nights, and a dreadful fluttering round the heart. And then I got a letter from a Scotch gentleman. As a matter of fact, there were 2 letters, both Scotch gentlemen. Mr. Bruce Macpherson was one, and the other were Colin MacDonald. Quite a coincidence. Hardly that, I said dryly. They are usually Scotch gentlemen, but I suspect a Semitic strain in their ancestry. £10 to 10,000 on note of hand alone, murmured Mrs. Ackroyd reminiscently. I wrote to one of them, but it seemed there were difficulties. She paused. I gathered that we were just coming to delicate ground. I have never known anyone more difficult to bring to the point. You see, murmured Mrs. Ackroyd, it's all a question of expectations, isn't it? Testamentary expectations. And though, of course, I expected that Roger would provide for me, I didn't know. I thought that if only I could glance over a copy of his will, not in any sense of vulgar prying, but just so that I could make my own arrangements. She glanced sideways at me. The position was now very delicate indeed. Fortunately, words, ingeniously used, will serve to mask the ugliness of naked facts. "I could only tell this to you, dear Dr. Sheppard," said Mrs. Ackroyd rapidly. "I can trust you not to misjudge me, and to represent the matter in the right light to Monsieur Poirot. It was on Friday afternoon." She came to a stop and swallowed uncertainly. "Yes," I repeated encouragingly. "On Friday afternoon. Well, everyone was out, or so I thought. And I went into Roger's study. I had some real reason for going there. I mean, there was nothing underhand about it. And as I saw all the papers heaped on the desk, it just came to me like a flash. I wonder if Roger keeps his will in one of the drawers of the desk. I'm so impulsive, always was. From a child. I do things on the spur of the moment. He'd left his keys, very careless of him, in the lock of the top drawer. "I see," I said helpfully. "So you searched the desk. Did you find the will?" Mrs. Ackroyd gave a little scream, and I realized that I had not been sufficiently diplomatic. How dreadful it sounds, but it wasn't at all like that, really. "Of course it wasn't," I said hastily. "You must forgive my unfortunate way of putting things. You see, men are so peculiar. In dear Roger's place, I should not have objected to revealing the provisions of my will. But men are so secretive. One is forced to adopt little subterfuges in self-defense." "And the result of the little subterfuge?" I asked. "That's just what I'm telling you. As I got to the bottom drawer, Bourne came in. Most awkward. Of course I shut the drawer and stood up, and I called her attention to a few specks of dust on the surface, but I didn't like the way she looked. Quite respectful in manner, but a very nasty light in her eyes. Almost contemptuous, if you know what I mean. I never have liked that girl very much. She's a good servant, and she says ma'am, and doesn't object to wearing caps and aprons, which I declare to you a lot of them do nowadays. And she can say not at home without scruples if she has to answer the door instead of Parker. And she doesn't have those peculiar gurgling noises inside which so many parlour-maids seem to have when they wait at table. Let me see, where was I? You were saying that in spite of several valuable qualities, you never liked Bourne. No more I do. She's odd. There's something different about her from the others. Too well educated, that's my opinion. You can't tell who are ladies and who aren't nowadays." "And what happened next?" I asked. "Nothing. At least Roger came in, and I thought he was out for a walk. And he said, 'What's all this?' And I said, 'Nothing. I just came in to fetch punch.' And I took punch and went out with it. Bourne stayed behind. I heard her asking Roger if she could speak to him for a minute. I went straight up to my room to lie down. I was very upset." There was a pause. "You will explain to Monsieur Poirot, won't you? You can see for yourself what a trivial matter the whole thing was. But of course, when he was so stern about concealing things, I thought of this at once. Bourne may have made some extraordinary story out of it, but you can explain, can't you?" "And that is all," I said. "You have told me everything?" "Yes," said Mrs. Ackroyd. "Oh, yes," she added firmly. But I had noted the momentary hesitation, and I knew that there was still something she was keeping back. It was nothing less than a flash of sheer genius that prompted me to ask the question I did. "Mrs. Ackroyd," I said, "was it you who left the silver table open?" I had my answer in the blush of guilt that even rouge and powder could not conceal. "How did you know?" she whispered. "It was you, then?" "Yes, you see, there were one or two pieces of old silver, very interesting. I had been reading up the subject, and there was an illustration of quite a small piece which had fetched an immense sum at Christie's. It looked to me just the same as the one in the silver table. I thought I would take it up to London with me when I went and have it valued. Then if it really was a valuable piece, just think what a charming surprise it would have been for Roger." I refrained from comments, accepting Mrs. Ackroyd's story on its merits. I even forbore to ask her why it was necessary to abstract what she wanted in such a surreptitious manner. "Why did you leave the lid open?" I asked. Did you forget?" "I was startled," said Mrs. Ackroyd. "I heard footsteps coming along the terrace outside. I hastened out of the room and just got up the stairs before Parker opened the front door to you." "That must have been Miss Russell," I said thoughtfully. Mrs. Ackroyd had revealed to me one fact that was extremely interesting. Whether her designs upon Ackroyd's silver had been strictly honourable, I neither knew nor cared. What did interest me was the fact that Miss Russell must have entered the drawing-room by the window, and that I had not been wrong when I judged her to be out of breath with running. Where had she been? I thought of the summer-house and the scrap of cambric. "I wonder if Miss Russell has her handkerchief starched," I exclaimed on the spur of the moment. Mrs. Ackroyd's start recalled me to myself, and I rose. "You think you can explain to Monsieur Poirot?" she asked anxiously. "Oh, certainly. Absolutely." I got away at last after being forced to listen to more justifications of her conduct. The parlour-maid was in the hall, and it was she who helped me on with my overcoat. I observed her more closely than I had done heretofore. It was clear that she had been crying. "How is it," I asked, "that you told us that Mr. Ackroyd sent for you on Friday to his study? I hear now that it was you who asked to speak to him?" For a minute, the girl's eyes dropped before mine. Then she spoke. "I meant to leave in any case," she said uncertainly. I said no more. She opened the front door for me. Just as I was passing out, she said suddenly in a low voice, "Excuse me, sir, is there any news of Captain Peyton?" I shook my head, looking at her inquiringly. "He ought to come back," she said. Indeed, he ought to come back." She was looking at me with appealing eyes. "Does no one know where he is?" she asked. "Do you?" I said sharply. She shook her head. "No, indeed, I know nothing, but anyone who was a friend to him would tell him this. He ought to come back." I lingered, thinking that perhaps the girl would say more. Her next question surprised me. "When do they think the murder was done? Just before 10 o'clock? "That is the idea," I said. "Between 9:45 and the hour. Not earlier? Not before 9:45? I looked at her attentively. She was so clearly eager for a reply in the affirmative. "That's out of the question," I said. "Miss Ackroyd saw her uncle alive at 9:45. She turned away, and her whole figure seemed to droop. "A handsome girl," I said to myself as I drove off. "An exceedingly handsome girl." Caroline was at home. She had had a visit from Poirot and was very pleased and important about it. "I am helping him with the case," she explained. I felt rather uneasy. Caroline is bad enough as it is. What will she be like with her detective instincts encouraged? "But are you going round the neighbourhood looking for Ralph Peyton's mysterious girl?" I inquired. "I might do that on my own account," said Caroline. "No, this is a special thing. Monsieur Poirot wants me to find out for him." "What is it?" I asked. "He wants to know whether Ralph Peyton's boots were black or brown," said Caroline with tremendous solemnity. I stared at her. I see now that I was unbelievably stupid about these boots. I failed altogether to grasp the point. "They were brown shoes," I said. "I saw them." "Not shoes, James, boots. M. Poirot wants to know whether a pair of boots Ralph had with him at the hotel were brown or black. A lot hangs on it. Call me dense if you like. I didn't see." "And how are you going to find out?" I asked. Caroline said there would be no difficulty about that. Our Annie's dearest friend was Miss Gannet's maid, Clara, and Clara was walking out with the boots at the Three Boars. The whole thing was simplicity itself, and by the aid of Miss Gannet, who cooperated loyally, at once giving Clara leave of absence, the matter was rushed through at express speed. It was when we were sitting down to lunch that Caroline remarked with would-be unconcern about those boots of Ralph Patton's. "Well," I said, "what about them?" "Monsieur Poirot thought they were probably brown. He was wrong. They're black." And Caroline nodded her head several times. She evidently felt that she had scored a point over Poirot. I did not answer. I was puzzling over what the colour of a pair of Ralph Paton's boots had to do with the case. Chapter 15. Geoffrey Raymond. I was to have a further proof that day of the success of Poirot's tactics. That challenge of his had been a subtle touch born of his knowledge of human nature. A mixture of fear and guilt had wrung the truth from Mrs. Ackroyd. She was the first to react. That afternoon, when I returned from seeing my patients, Caroline told me that Geoffrey Raymond had just left. "Did he want to see me?" I asked, as I hung up my coat in the hall. Caroline was hovering by my elbow. "It was Monsieur Poirot he wanted to see," she said. "He'd just come from the Larches. Monsieur Poirot was out. Mr. Raymond thought that he might be here, or that you might know where he was. I haven't the least idea." "I tried to make him wait," said Caroline, "but he said he would call back at the Larches in half an hour, and went away down the village. A great pity, because Monsieur Poirot came in practically the minute after he left." "Came in here?" "No, to his own house." "How do you know?" "The side window," said Caroline briefly. It seemed to me that we had now exhausted the topic. Caroline thought otherwise. "Aren't you going across?" "Across where?" "To the Larches, of course." "My dear Caroline," I said, "what for?" "Mr. Raymond wanted to see him very particularly," said Caroline. "You might hear what it's all about." I raised my eyebrows. "Curiosity is not my besetting sin," I remarked coldly. "I can exist comfortably without knowing exactly what my neighbours are doing and thinking." "Stuff and nonsense, James," said my sister. "You want to know just as much as I do. You're not so honest, that's all. You always have to pretend." "Really, Caroline," I said, and retired into my surgery. 10 minutes later, Caroline tapped at the door and entered. In her hand, she held what seemed to be a pot of jam. "I wonder, James," she said, "if you would mind taking this pot of medlar jelly across to Monsieur Poirot? I promised it to him. He has never tasted any homemade medlar jelly." "Why can't Annie go?" I asked coldly. "She's doing some mending. I can't spare her." Caroline and I looked at each other. "Very well," I said, rising. "But if I take the beastly thing, I shall just leave it at the door. You understand that?" My sister raised her eyebrows. "Naturally," she said. "Who suggested you should do anything else?" "The honours were with Caroline." "If you do happen to see Monsieur Poirot," she said as I opened the front door, "you might tell him about the boots." It was a most subtle, parting shot. I wanted dreadfully to understand the enigma of the boots. When the old lady with the Breton cap opened the door to me, I found myself asking if Monsieur Poirot was in, quite automatically. Poirot sprang up to meet me with every appearance of pleasure. "Sit down, my good friend," he said. "The big chair? This small one? The room is not too hot, no?" I thought it was stifling, but refrained from saying so. The windows were closed, and a large fire burned in the grate. "The English people, they have a mania for the fresh air," declared Poirot. "The big air, it's all very well outside, where it belongs. Why admit it to the house? But let us not discuss such banalities. You have something for me, yes?" "Two things," I said. "First, this, from my sister." I handed over the pot of medlar jelly. "How kind of Mademoiselle Caroline. She has remembered her promise. And the second thing? Information of a kind." And I told him of my interview with Mrs. Ackroyd. He listened with interest, but not much excitement. "It clears the ground," he said thoughtfully, "and it has a certain value as confirming the evidence of the housekeeper. She said, you remember, that she found the silver table lid open and closed it down in passing." "What about her statement that she went into the drawing-room to see if the flowers were fresh?" "Ah, we never took that very seriously, did we, my friend? It was patently an excuse, trumped up in a hurry by a woman who felt it urgent to explain her presence, which, by the way, you would probably never have thought of questioning." I considered it possible that her agitation might arise from the fact that she had been tampering with the silver table, but I think now that we must look for another cause. "Yes," I said. "Whom did she go out to meet, and why?" "You think she went to meet someone?" "I do." Poirot nodded. "So do I," he said thoughtfully. There was a pause. "By the way," I said, "I've got a message for you from my sister. Ralph Patton's boots were black, not brown." I was watching him closely as I gave the message, and I fancied that I saw a momentary flicker of discomposure. If so, it passed almost immediately. "She is absolutely positive they are not brown?" "Absolutely." "Ah," said Poirot regretfully, "that is a pity." And he seemed quite crestfallen. He entered into no explanations, but at once started a new subject of conversation. "The housekeeper, Miss Russell, who came to consult you on that Friday morning, is it indiscreet to ask what passed at the interview, apart from the medical details, I mean?" "Not at all," I said. When the professional part of the conversation was over, we talked for a few minutes about poisons and the ease or difficulty of detecting them, and about drug-taking and drug-takers. "With special reference to cocaine?" asked Poirot. "How did you know?" I asked, somewhat surprised. For answer, the little man rose and crossed the room to where newspapers were filed. He brought me a copy of the Daily Budget, dated Friday, the 16th of September, and showed me an article dealing with the smuggling of cocaine. It was a somewhat lurid article, written with an eye to picturesque effect. "That is what put cocaine into her head, my friend," he said. I would have catechized him further, for I did not quite understand his meaning. But at that moment the door opened, and Geoffrey Raymond was announced. He came in fresh and debonair as ever, and greeted us both. "How are you, Doctor?" "Monsieur Poirot, this is the second time I've been here this morning. I was anxious to catch you." "Perhaps I'd better be off," I suggested, rather awkwardly. "Not on my account, Doctor. No, it's just this," he went on, seating himself at a wave of invitation from Poirot. "I've got a confession to make." "En vérité?" said Poirot, with an air of polite interest. "Oh, it's of no consequence, really. But as a matter of fact, my conscience has been pricking me ever since yesterday afternoon. You accused us all of keeping back something, Monsieur Poirot. I plead guilty. I've had something up my sleeve." "And what is that, Monsieur Raymond?" "As I say, it's nothing of consequence. Just this. I was in debt. Badly. And that legacy came in the nick of time. £500 puts me on my feet again with a little to spare." He smiled at us both with that engaging frankness that made him such a likable youngster. "You know how it is. Suspicious-looking policemen don't like to admit you are hard up for money, think it will look bad to them. But I was a fool, really, because Blunt and I were in the billiard room from 9:45 onwards, so I've got a watertight alibi and nothing to fear. Still, when you thundered out that stuff about concealing things, I felt a nasty prick of conscience, and I thought I'd like to get it off my mind." He got up again and stood smiling at us. "You are a very wise young man," said Poirot, nodding at him with approval. "See you, when I know that anyone is hiding things from me, I suspect that the thing hidden may be something very bad indeed." "You have done well." "I'm glad I'm cleared from suspicion," laughed Raymond. "I'll be off now." "So that is that," I remarked, as the door closed behind the young secretary. "Yes," agreed Poirot, "a mere bagatelle. But if he had not been in the billiard room, who knows? After all, many crimes have been committed for the sake of less than £500. It all depends on what sum is sufficient to break a man. A question of the relativity, is it not so? Have you reflected, my friend, that many people in that house stood to benefit by Mr. Ackroyd's death? Mrs. Ackroyd, Miss Flora, young Mr. Raymond, the housekeeper, Miss Russell. Only one, in fact, does not, Major Blunt." His tone in uttering that name was so peculiar that I looked up. puzzled. "I don't quite understand you," I said. "Two of the people I accused have given me the truth." "You think Major Blunt has something to conceal also?" "As for that," remarked Poirot nonchalantly, "there is a saying, is there not, that Englishmen conceal only one thing, their love. And Major Blunt, I should say, is not good at concealments." "Sometimes," I said, "I wonder if we haven't rather jumped to conclusions on one point." "What is that?" "We've assumed that the blackmailer of Mrs. Ferrars is necessarily the murderer of Mr. Ackroyd. Mightn't we be mistaken?" Poirot nodded energetically. Very good indeed. I wondered if that idea would come to you. Of course it is possible. But we must remember one point. The letter disappeared. Still, that, as you say, may not necessarily mean that the murderer took it. When you first found the body, Parker may have abstracted the letter unnoticed by you. Parker? Yes, Parker. I always come back to Parker, not as the murderer. No, he did not commit the murder. But who is more suitable than he as the mysterious scoundrel who terrorized Mrs. Ferrars? He may have got his information about Mr. Ferrars' death from one of the King's paddock servants. At any rate, he is more likely to have come upon it than a casual guest, such as Blunt, for instance. Parker might have taken the letter, I admitted. It wasn't till later that I noticed it was gone. How much later? After Blunt and Raymond were in the room, or before? I can't remember, I said slowly. I think it was before. No. Afterwards. Yes, I'm almost sure it was afterwards. That widens the field to 3, said Poirot thoughtfully. But Parker is the most likely. It is in my mind to try a little experiment with Parker. How say you, my friend? Will you accompany me to Fernley? I acquiesced, and we set out at once. Poirot asked to see Miss Ackroyd, and presently Flora came to us. Mademoiselle Flora, said Poirot, I have to confide in you a little secret. I am not yet satisfied of the innocence of Parker. I propose to make a little experiment with your assistance. I want to reconstruct some of his actions on that night. But we must think of something to tell him. Ah, I have it. I wish to satisfy myself as to whether voices in the little lobby could have been heard outside on the terrace. Now ring for Parker, if you will be so good. I did so, and presently the butler appeared, suave as ever. You rang, sir? Yes, my good Parker. I have in mind a little experiment. I have placed Major Blunt on the terrace outside the study window. I want to see if anyone there could have heard the voices of Miss Ackroyd and yourself in the lobby that night. I want to enact that little scene over again. Perhaps you would fetch the tray, or whatever it was you were carrying. Parker vanished, and we repaired to the lobby outside the study door. Presently we heard a chink in the outer hall, and Parker appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with a siphon, a decanter of whisky, and 2 glasses on it. "One moment," cried Poirot, raising his hand and seemingly very excited. "We must have everything in order, just as it occurred. It is a little method of mine." "A foreign custom, sir," said Parker. "Reconstruction of the crime they call it, do they not?" He was quite imperturbable as he stood there politely waiting on Poirot's orders. "Ah, he knows something, the good Parker," cried Poirot. "He has read of these things. Now, I beg you, let us have everything of the most exact. You came from the outer hall, so Mademoiselle was where?" "Here," said Flora, taking up her stand just outside the study door. "Quite right, sir," said Parker. "I had just closed the door," continued Flora. "Yes, miss," agreed Parker. "Your hand was still on the handle as it is now." "Then allez," said Poirot. "Play me the little comedy." Flora stood with her hand on the door handle, and Parker came stepping through the door from the hall, bearing the tray. He stopped just inside the door. Flora spoke. "Oh, Parker, Mr. Ackroyd doesn't want to be disturbed again tonight. Is that right?" she added in an undertone. "To the best of my recollection, Miss Flora," said Parker, "but I fancy you used the word evening instead of night." Then, raising his voice in a somewhat theatrical fashion, "Very good, miss. Shall I lock up as usual?" "Yes, please." Parker retired through the door. Flora followed him and started to ascend the main staircase. "Is that enough?" she asked over her shoulder. "Admirable," declared the little man, rubbing his hands. "By the way, Parker, are you sure there were 2 glasses on the tray that evening? Who was the second one for?" "I always bring 2 glasses, sir," said Parker. "Is there anything further?" "Nothing. I thank you." Parker withdrew, dignified to the last. Poirot stood in the middle of the hall, frowning. Flora came down and joined us. "Has your experiment been successful?" she asked. "I don't quite understand, you know." Poirot smiled admiringly at her. "It is not necessary that you should," he said. "But tell me, were there indeed 2 glasses on Parker's tray that night?" Flora wrinkled her brows a minute. "I really can't remember," she said. "I think there were. Is that the object of your experiment?" Poirot took her hand and patted it. "Put it this way," he said. "I'm always interested to see if people will speak the truth." "And did Parker speak the truth?" "I rather think he did," said Poirot thoughtfully. A few minutes later saw us retracing our steps to the village. "What was the point of that question about the glasses?" I asked, curiously. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. "One must say something," he remarked. "That particular question did as well as any other." I stared at him. "At any rate, my friend," he said more seriously, "I know now something I wanted to know." Let us leave it at that. Chapter 16. An evening at Mahjong. That night we had a little Mahjong party. This kind of simple entertainment is very popular in King's Abbot. The guests arrive in goloshes and waterproofs after dinner. They partake of coffee and later of cake, sandwiches, and tea. On this particular night our guests were Miss Gannett and Colonel Carter, who lives near the church. A good deal of gossip is handed round at these evenings, sometimes seriously interfering with the game in progress. We used to play bridge, chatty bridge of the worst description. We find Mahjong much more peaceful. The irritated demand as to why on earth your partner did not lead a certain card is entirely done away with, and though we still express criticisms frankly, there is not the same acrimonious spirit. "Very cold evening, eh, Sheppard?" said Colonel Carter, standing with his back to the fire. Caroline had taken Miss Gannett to her own room, and was there assisting her to disentangle herself from her many wraps. "Reminds me of the Afghan passes." "Indeed," I said politely. "Very mysterious business this about poor Ackroyd," continued the Colonel, accepting a cup of coffee. "A deuce of a lot behind it. That's what I say. Between you and me, Sheppard, I've heard the word blackmail mentioned." The Colonel gave me the look which might be tabulated, "one man of the world to another." "A woman in it, no doubt," he said. "Depend upon it, a woman in it." Caroline and Miss Gannett joined us at this minute. Miss Gannett drank coffee whilst Caroline got out the Mahjong box and poured out the tiles upon the table. "Washing the tiles," said the Colonel facetiously. "That's right, washing the tiles, as we used to say in the Shanghai Club." It is the private opinion of both Caroline and myself that Colonel Carter has never been in the Shanghai Club in his life. More, that he has never been farther east than India, where he juggled with tins of bully beef and plum and apple jam during the Great War. But the Colonel is determinedly military, and in King's Abbot we permit people to indulge their little idiosyncrasies freely. "Shall we begin?" said Caroline. We sat round the table. For some 5 minutes there was complete silence, owing to the fact that there is tremendous secret competition amongst us as to who can build their wall quickest. "Go on, James," said Caroline at last, "your east wind." I discarded a tile. A round or two proceeded, broken by the monotonous remarks of 3 bamboos. 2 circles, pung, and frequently from Miss Gannett unpung, owing to that lady's habit of too hastily claiming tiles to which she had no right. "I saw Flora Ackroyd this morning," said Miss Gannett. "Pung, no, unpung. I made a mistake." "4 circles," said Caroline. "Where did you see her?" "She didn't see me," said Miss Gannett, with that tremendous significance only to be met with in small villages. "Ah," said Caroline interestedly. "Chow?" "I believe," said Miss Gannett, temporarily diverted, "that it's the right thing nowadays to say cheese not. Chow." "Nonsense," said Caroline. "I've always said chow." "In the Shanghai Club," said Colonel Carter, "they say chow." Miss Gannett retired, crushed. "What were you saying about Flora Ackroyd?" asked Caroline, after a moment or two devoted to the game. "Was she with anyone?" "Very much so," said Miss Gannett. The eyes of the 2 ladies met, and seemed to exchange information. "Really?" said Caroline interestedly. "Is that it? Well, it doesn't surprise me in the least." "We're waiting for you to discard, Miss Caroline," said the Colonel. He sometimes affects the pose of the bluff male, intent on the game and indifferent to gossip. But nobody is deceived. "If you ask me," said Miss Gannett, "was that a bamboo you discarded, dear?" "Oh, no, I see now. It was a circle. As I was saying, if you ask me, Flora's been exceedingly lucky. Exceedingly lucky she's been." "How's that, Miss Gannett?" asked the Colonel. "I'll pung that green dragon. How do you make out that Miss Flora's been lucky? Very charming girl and all that, I know." "I mayn't know very much about crime," said Miss Gannett, with the air of one who knows everything there is to know. "But I can tell you one thing. The first question that's always asked is, who last saw the deceased alive? And the person who did is regarded with suspicion. Now, Flora Ackroyd last saw her uncle alive. It might have looked very nasty for her, very nasty indeed. It's my opinion, and I give it for what it's worth, that Ralph Peyton is staying away on her account, to draw suspicion away from her." "Come now," I protested mildly, "you surely can't suggest that a young girl like Flora Ackroyd is capable of stabbing her uncle in cold blood?" "Well, I don't know," said Miss Gannett. "I've just been reading a book from the library about the underworld of Paris, and it says that some of the worst women criminals are young girls with the faces of angels." "That's in France?" said Caroline instantly. "Just so," said the Colonel. "Now, I'll tell you a very curious thing, a story that was going round the bazaars in India." The Colonel's story was one of interminable length and of curiously little interest. A thing that happened in India many years ago cannot compare for a moment with an event that took place in King's Abbot the day before yesterday. It was Caroline who brought the Colonel's story to a close by fortunately going mahjong. After the slight unpleasantness always occasioned by my corrections of Caroline's somewhat faulty arithmetic, we started a new hand. "East wind passes," said Caroline. "I've got an idea of my own about Ralph Peyton, 3 characters, but I'm keeping it to myself for the present." "Are you, dear?" said Miss Gannett. "Chow, I mean pung." "Yes," said Caroline firmly. "Was it all right about the boots?" asked Miss Gannett. "Their being black, I mean." "Quite all right," said Caroline. "What was the point, do you think?" asked Miss Gannett. Caroline pursed up her lips and shook her head with an air of knowing all about it. "Pung?" said Miss Gannett. "No, unpung. I suppose that now the doctor's in with Monsieur Poirot, he knows all the secrets." "Far from it," I said. "James is so modest," said Caroline. "Ah, a concealed Kong." The Colonel gave vent to a whistle. For the moment, gossip was forgotten. "Your own wind too," he said. "And you've got 2 pungs of dragons. We must be careful. Miss Caroline's out for a big hand." We played for some minutes with no irrelevant conversation. "This Monsieur Poirot now," said Colonel Carter, "is he really such a great detective?" "The greatest the world has ever known," said Caroline solemnly. "He had to come here incognito to avoid publicity." "Ciao," said Miss Gannett. "Quite wonderful for our little village, I'm sure. By the way, Clara, my maid, you know, is great friends with Elsie, the housemaid at Fernley. And what do you think Elsie told her? That there's been a lot of money stolen, and it's her opinion. That the parlour maid had something to do with it. She's leaving at the month, and she's crying a good deal at night. If you ask me, the girl is very likely in league with a gang. She's always been a queer girl. She's not friends with any of the girls round here. She goes off by herself on her days out. Very unnatural, I call it, and most suspicious. I asked her once to come to our girls' friendly evenings, but she refused. And then I asked her a few questions about her home and her family. All that sort of thing, and I'm bound to say I considered her manner most impertinent. Outwardly very respectful, but she shut me up in the most barefaced way." Miss Gannett stopped for breath, and the colonel, who was totally uninterested in the servant question, remarked that in the Shanghai Club, brisk play was the invariable rule. We had a round of brisk play. "That Miss Russell," said Caroline. "She came here pretending to consult James on Friday morning. It's my opinion she wanted to see where the poisons were kept. 5 characters." "Ciao," said Miss Gannett. "What an extraordinary idea. I wonder if you can be right." "Talking of poisons," said the colonel. What? Haven't I discarded? Oh, 8 bamboos." "Mahjong," said Miss Gannett. Caroline was very much annoyed. "1 red dragon," she said regretfully, "and I should have had a hand of 3 doubles." "I've had 2 red dragons all the time," I mentioned. "So exactly like you, James," said Caroline reproachfully. "You've no conception of the spirit of the game." I myself thought I had played rather cleverly. I should have had to pay Caroline an enormous amount if she had gone mahjong. Miss Gannett's mahjong was of the poorest variety possible, as Caroline did not fail to point out to her. East wind passed, and we started a new hand in silence. "What I was going to tell you just now was this," said Caroline. "Yes," said Miss Gannett encouragingly. "My idea about Ralph Peyton, I mean." "Yes, dear," said Miss Gannett, still more encouragingly. "Ciao." "It's a sign of weakness to chow so early," said Caroline severely. "You should go for a big hand." "I know," said Miss Gannett. "You were saying about Ralph Peyton, you know?" "Yes. Well, I've a pretty shrewd idea where he is." We all stopped to stare at her. "This is very interesting, Miss Caroline," said Colonel Carter. "All your own idea, eh?" "Well, not exactly. I'll tell you about it. You know that big map of the county we have in the hall?" We all said yes. As Monsieur Poirot was going out the other day, he stopped and looked at it, and he made some remark. I can't remember exactly what it was. Something about Cranchester being the only big town anywhere near us, which is true, of course. But after he had gone, it came to me suddenly. "What came to you?" "His meaning. Of course Ralph is in Cranchester." It was at that moment that I knocked down the rack that held my pieces. My sister immediately reproved me for clumsiness, but half-heartedly. She was intent on her theory. "Cranchester, Miss Caroline," said Colonel Carter. "Surely not Cranchester. It's so near." "That's exactly it," cried Caroline triumphantly. "It seems quite clear by now that he didn't get away from here by train. He must simply have walked into Cranchester, and I believe he's there still. No one would dream of his being so near at hand." I pointed out several objections to the theory, but when once Caroline has got something firmly into her head, nothing dislodges it. "And you think Monsieur Poirot has the same idea," said Miss Gannett thoughtfully. "It's a curious coincidence, but I was out for a walk this afternoon on the Cranchester Road, and he passed me in a car coming from that direction." We all looked at each other. "Why, dear me," said Miss Gannett suddenly, "I'm mahjong all the time, and I never noticed it." Caroline's attention was distracted from her own inventive exercises. She pointed out to Miss Gannett, that a hand consisting of mixed suits and too many chows was hardly worth going mahjong on. Miss Gannett listened imperturbably and collected her counters. "Yes, dear, I know what you mean," she said. "But it rather depends on what kind of a hand you have to start with, doesn't it?" "You'll never get the big hands if you don't go for them," urged Caroline. "Well, we must all play our own way, mustn't we?" said Miss Gannett. She looked down at her counters. "After all, I'm up so far." Caroline, who was considerably down, said nothing. East wind passed, and we set to once more. Annie brought in the tea things. Caroline and Miss Gannett were both slightly ruffled, as is often the case during one of these festive evenings. "If you would only play a little quicker, dear," said Caroline, as Miss Gannett hesitated over her discard. "The Chinese put down the tiles so quickly it sounds like little birds pattering." For some few minutes we played like the Chinese. "You haven't contributed much to the sum of information, Sheppard," said Colonel Carter genially. "You're a sly dog, hand in glove with the great detective, and not a hint as to the way things are going." "James is an extraordinary creature," said Caroline. "He cannot bring himself to part with information." She looked at me with some disfavour. "I assure you," I said, "that I don't know anything. Poirot keeps his own counsel." "Wise man," said the Colonel with a chuckle. "He doesn't give himself away. But they're wonderful fellows, these foreign detectives. Up to all sorts of dodges, I believe." "Pung," said Miss Gannett, in a tone of quiet triumph. "And mahjong." The situation became more strained. It was annoyance at Miss Gannett's going mahjong for the third time running which prompted Caroline to say to me as we built a fresh wall, "You are too tiresome, James. You sit there like a deadhead and say nothing at all." "But, my dear," I protested, "I have really nothing to say, that is, of the kind you mean." "Nonsense," said Caroline as she sorted her hand. "You must know something interesting." I did not answer for a moment. I was overwhelmed and intoxicated. I had read of there being such a thing as the perfect winning, going mahjong on one's original hand. I had never hoped to hold the hand myself. With suppressed triumph, I laid my hand face upwards on the table. "As they say in the Shanghai Club," I remarked, "tin ho, the perfect winning." The Colonel's eyes nearly bulged out of his head. "Upon my soul," he said, "what an extraordinary thing! I never saw that happen before." It was then that I went on, goaded by Caroline's gibes and rendered reckless by my triumph. "And as to anything interesting," I said, "what about a gold wedding ring with a date and from R inside?" I pass over the scene that followed. I was made to say exactly where this treasure was found. I was made to reveal the date. "March 13th, said Caroline. "Just 6 months ago." "Ah!" Out of the babel of excited suggestions and suppositions, 3 theories were evolved. 1. That of Colonel Carter, that Ralph was secretly married to Flora, the first or most simple solution. 2. That of Miss Gannett, that Roger Ackroyd had been secretly married to Mrs. Ferrars. 3. That of my sister, that Roger Ackroyd had married his housekeeper, Miss Russell. A 4th or super theory was propounded by Caroline later as we went up to bed. "Mark my words," she said suddenly, "I shouldn't be at all surprised if Geoffrey Raymond and Flora weren't married." "Surely it would be from G, not from R then," I suggested. "You never know. Some girls call men by their surnames. And you heard what Miss Gannett said this evening about Flora's carryings-on." Strictly speaking, I had not heard Miss Gannett say anything of the kind, but I respected Caroline's knowledge of innuendos. "How about Hector Blunt?" I hinted. "If it's anybody—" "Nonsense," said Caroline. "I dare say he admires her, may even be in love with her. But depend upon it, a girl isn't going to fall in love with a man old enough to be her father when there's a good-looking young secretary about. She may encourage Major Blunt just as a blind. Girls are very artful. But there's one thing I do tell you, James Sheppard. Flora Ackroyd does not care a penny piece for Ralph Peyton, and never has. You can take it from me." I took it from her meekly. Chapter 17. Parker. It occurred to me the next morning that under the exhilaration produced by Tin Ho, or the perfect winning, I might have been slightly indiscreet. True, Poirot had not asked me to keep the discovery of the ring to myself. On the other hand, he had said nothing about it whilst at Fernley, and as far as I knew, I was the only person aware that it had been found. I felt distinctly guilty. The fact was by now spreading through King's Abbot like wildfire. I was expecting wholesale reproaches from Poirot any minute. The joint funeral of Mrs. Ferrars and Roger Ackroyd was fixed for 11 o'clock. It was a melancholy and impressive ceremony. All the party from Fernley were there. After it was over, Poirot, who had also been present, took me by the arm and invited me to accompany him back to the Larches. He was looking very grave, and I feared that my indiscretion of the night before had got round to his ears. But it soon transpired that his thoughts were occupied by something of a totally different nature. "See you," he said. "We must act. With your help, I propose to examine a witness. We will question him. We will put such fear into him that the truth is bound to come out." "What witness are you talking of?" I asked, very much surprised. "Parker," said Poirot. "I asked him to be at my house this morning at 12 o'clock. He should await us there at this very minute." "What do you think?" I ventured, glancing sideways at his face. "I know this, that I am not satisfied. You think that it was he who blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars?" "Either that or—" "Well," I said, after waiting a minute or two, "my friend, I will say this to you. I hope it was he." The gravity of his manner, and something indefinable that tinged it, reduced me to silence. On arrival at the Larches, we were informed that Parker was already there awaiting our return. As we entered the room, the butler rose respectfully. "Good morning, Parker," said Poirot pleasantly. "One instant, I pray of you." He removed his overcoat and gloves. "Allow me, sir," said Parker, and sprang forward to assist him. He deposited the articles neatly on a chair by the door. Poirot watched him with approval. "Thank you, my good Parker," he said. "Take a seat, will you not? What I have to say may take some time." Parker seated himself with an apologetic bend of the head. "Now what do you think I asked you to come here for this morning, eh?" Parker coughed. "I understood, sir, that you wished to ask me a few questions about my late master. Private-like?" "Precisement," said Poirot, beaming. "Have you made many experiments in blackmail?" "Sir!" The butler sprang to his feet. "Do not excite yourself," said Poirot placidly. "Do not play the farce of the honest, injured man. You know all there is to know about the blackmail, is it not so?" "Sir, I've never been—" "Insulted," suggested Poirot, "in such a way before. Then why, my excellent Parker, were you so anxious to overhear the conversation in Mr. Ackroyd's study the other evening, after you had caught the word blackmail?" "I wasn't— "Who was your last master?" rapped out Poirot suddenly. "My last master?" "Yes, the master you were with before you came to Mr. Ackroyd." "A Major Ellaby, sir." Poirot took the words out of his mouth. "Just so, Major Ellaby. Major Ellaby was addicted to drugs, was he not? You travelled about with him. When he was in Bermuda there was some trouble. A man was killed. Major Ellaby was partly responsible. It was hushed up, but you knew about it. How much did Major Ellaby pay you to keep your mouth shut?" Parker was staring at him open-mouthed. The man had gone to pieces. His cheeks shook flabbily. "You see me, I have made inquiries," said Poirot pleasantly. "It is as I say. You got a good sum then as blackmail, and Major Ellaby went on paying you until he died. Now I want to hear about your latest experiment." Parker still stared. It is useless to deny. Hercule Poirot knows. It is so what I have said about Major Ellaby, is it not? As though against his will, Parker nodded reluctantly once. His face was ashen pale. "But I never hurt a hair of Mr. Ackroyd's head," he moaned. "Honest to God, sir, I didn't. I've been afraid of this coming all the time, and I tell you I didn't kill him." His voice rose almost to a scream. "I'm inclined to believe you, my friend," said Poirot. "You have not the nerve, the courage, but I must have the truth." "I'll tell you anything, sir, anything you want to know. It's true that I tried to listen that night. A word or two I heard made me curious. And Mr. Ackroyd's wanting not to be disturbed, and shutting himself up with the doctor the way he did. It's God's own truth, what I told the police. I heard the word blackmail, sir, and well—" He paused. "You thought there might be something in it for you?" suggested Poirot smoothly. Well, yes, I did, sir. I thought that if Mr. Ackroyd was being blackmailed, why shouldn't I have a share of the pickings?" A very curious expression passed over Poirot's face. He leaned forward. "Had you any reason to suppose before that night that Mr. Ackroyd was being blackmailed?" "No, indeed, sir. It was a great surprise to me. Such a regular gentleman in all his habits." "How much did you overhear?" "Not very much, sir. There seemed what I might call a spite against me. Of course I had to attend to my duties in the pantry, and when I did creep along, once or twice, to the study, it was no use. The first time Dr. Sheppard came out and almost caught me in the act, and another time Mr. Raymond passed me in the big hall and went that way, so I knew it was no use, and when I went with the tray, Miss Flora headed me off." Poirot stared for a long time at the man, as if to test his sincerity. Parker returned his gaze earnestly. "I hope you believe me, sir. I've been afraid all along the police would rake up that old business with Major Ellaby and be suspicious of me in consequence." "Eh bien," said Poirot at last. "I am disposed to believe you. But there is one thing I must request of you, to show me your bank book. You have a bank book, I presume?" "Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, I have it with me now." With no sign of confusion, he produced it from his pocket. Poirot took the slim, green-covered book and perused the entries. "Ah, I perceive you have purchased £500 of National Savings Certificates this year?" "Yes, sir." "I have already over £1,000 saved, the result of my connection with my late master, Major Ellaby, and I have had quite a little flutter on some horses this year, very successful. If you remember, sir, a rank outsider won the Jubilee. I was fortunate enough to back it. £20. Poirot handed him back the book. "I will wish you good morning. I believe that you have told me the truth. If you have not, so much the worse for you, my friend." When Parker had departed, Poirot picked up his overcoat once more. "Going out again?" I asked. "Yes, we will pay a little visit to the good Monsieur Hammond." "You believe Parker's story? It is credible enough on the face of it. It seems clear that, unless he is a very good actor indeed, he genuinely believes it was Ackroyd himself who was the victim of blackmail. If so, he knows nothing at all about the Mrs. Ferrars business. Then in that case, who—" "Précisément. Who? But our visit to Monsieur Hammond will accomplish one purpose. It will either clear Parker completely or else—" "Well?" "I fall into the bad habit of leaving my sentences unfinished this morning," said Poirot apologetically. "You must bear with me." "By the way," I said rather sheepishly, "I've got a confession to make. I'm afraid I have inadvertently let out something about that ring." "What ring?" "The ring you found in the goldfish pond." "Ah, yes," said Poirot, smiling broadly. "I hope you're not annoyed. It was very careless of me." "But not at all, my good friend, not at all. I laid no commands upon you. You were at liberty to speak of it if you so wished. She was interested, your sister?" "She was indeed. It created a sensation. All sorts of theories are flying about." "Ah, and yet it is so simple. The true explanation leapt to the eye, did it not? "Did it?" I said dryly. Poirot laughed. "The wise man does not commit himself," he observed. "Is not that so? But here we are, at Mr. Hammond's." The lawyer was in his office, and we were ushered in without any delay. He rose and greeted us in his dry, precise manner. Poirot came at once to the point. "Monsieur, I desire from you certain information, that is, if you will be so good as to give it to me. You acted, I understand, for the late Mrs. Ferrars of King's Paddock." I noticed the swift gleam of surprise which showed in the lawyer's eyes, before his professional reserve came down once more like a mask over his face. "Certainly. All her affairs passed through our hands." "Very good. Now, before I ask you to tell me anything, I should like you to listen to the story Dr. Sheppard will relate to you. You have no objection, have you, my friend, to repeating the conversation you had with Mr. Ackroyd last Friday night?" "Not in the least," I said, and straightway began the recital of that strange evening. Hammond listened with close attention. "That is all," I said when I had finished. "Blackmail," said the lawyer thoughtfully. "You are surprised?" asked Poirot. The lawyer took off his pince-nez and polished them with his handkerchief. "No," he replied, "I can hardly say that I am surprised. I have suspected something of the kind for some time." "That brings us," said Poirot, "to the information for which I am asking. If anyone can give us an idea of the actual sums paid, you are the man, monsieur." "I see no object in withholding the information," said Hammond, after a moment or two. "During the past year, Mrs. Ferrars has sold out certain securities, and the money for them was paid into her account and not reinvested. As her income was a large one, and she lived very quietly after her husband's death, it seems certain that these sums of money were paid away for some special purpose. I once sounded her on the subject, and she said that she was obliged to support several of her husband's poor relations. I let the matter drop, of course. Until now, I have always imagined that the money was paid to some woman who had had a claim on Ashley Ferrars. I never dreamed that Mrs. Ferrars herself was involved." "And the amount?" asked Poirot. "In all, I should say the various sums totaled at least £20,000. £20,000! I exclaimed. "In 1 year?" "Mrs. Ferrars was a very wealthy woman," said Poirot dryly, "and the penalty for murder is not a pleasant one." "Is there anything else that I can tell you?" inquired Mr. Hammond. "I thank you, no," said Poirot, rising. "All my excuses for having deranged you." "Not at all, not at all." "The word derange," I remarked when we were outside again, "is applicable to mental disorder only." "Ah!" cried Poirot, "never will my English be quite perfect. A curious language. I should then have said disarranged, n'est-ce pas? Disturbed is the word you had in mind." "I thank you, my friend. The word exact, you are zealous for it. Eh bien, what about our friend Parker now? With £20,000 in hand, would he have continued being a butler? Je ne pense pas. It is, of course, possible that he banked the money under another name, but I am disposed to believe he spoke the truth to us. If he is a scoundrel, he is a scoundrel on a mean scale. He has not the big ideas. That leaves us as a possibility, Raymond, or, well, Major Blunt." "Surely not Raymond," I objected, "since we know that he was desperately hard up for a matter of £500. "That is what he says, yes. And as to Hector Blunt—" "I will tell you something as to the good Major Blunt," interrupted Poirot. "It is my business to make inquiries. I make them. Eh bien, that legacy of which he speaks, I have discovered that the amount of it was close upon £20,000. What do you think of that?" I was so taken aback that I could hardly speak. "It's impossible," I said at last. "A well-known man like Hector Blunt." Poirot shrugged his shoulders. "Who knows? At least he is a man with big ideas. I confess that I hardly see him as a blackmailer, but there is another possibility that you have not even considered." What is that? The fire, my friend. Ackroyd himself may have destroyed that letter, blue envelope and all, after you left him. I hardly think that likely, I said slowly. And yet, of course, it may be so. He might have changed his mind. We had just arrived at my house, and on the spur of the moment I invited Poirot to come in and take potluck. I thought Caroline would be pleased with me, but it is hard to satisfy one's womenfolk. It appears that we were eating chops for lunch, the kitchen staff being regaled on tripe and onions, and 2 chops set before 3 people are productive of embarrassment. But Caroline is seldom daunted for long. With magnificent mendacity, she explained to Poirot that although James laughed at her for doing so, she adhered strictly to a vegetarian diet. She descanted ecstatically on the delights of nut cutlets, which I am quite sure she has never tasted, and ate a Welsh rarebit with gusto and frequent cutting remarks as to the dangers of flesh foods. But afterwards, when we were sitting in front of the fire and smoking, Caroline attacked Poirot directly. "Not found Ralph Paton yet?" she asked. "Where should I find him, mademoiselle?" "I thought perhaps you'd found him in Cranchester," said Caroline, with intense meaning in her tone. Poirot looked merely bewildered. "In Cranchester? But why in Cranchester?" I enlightened him with a touch of malice. "One of our ample staff of private detectives happened to see you in a car on the Cranchester Road yesterday," I explained. Poirot's bewilderment vanished. He laughed heartily. "Ah, that. A simple visit to the dentist, c'est tout. My tooth, it aches. I go there. My tooth, it is at once better. I think to return quickly. The dentist, he says no. Better to have it out, I argue. He insists. He has his way. That particular tooth, it will never ache again." Caroline collapsed rather like a pricked balloon. We fell to discussing Ralph Paton. "A weak nature," I insisted, "but not a vicious one." "Ah," said Poirot, "but weakness, where does it end?" "Exactly," said Caroline. "Take James here, weak as water if I weren't about to look after him." "My dear Caroline," I said irritably, "can't you talk without dragging in personalities?" "You're weak, James," said Caroline, quite unmoved. "I'm 8 years older than you are. Oh, I don't mind Monsieur Poirot knowing that—" "I should never have guessed it, mademoiselle," said Poirot, with a gallant little bow. 8 years older, but I've always considered it my duty to look after you. With a bad bringing up, heaven knows what mischief you might have got into by now." "I might have married a beautiful adventuress," I murmured, gazing at the ceiling and blowing smoke rings. "Adventuress," said Caroline with a snort. "If we are talking of adventuresses—" She left the sentence unfinished. "Well?" I said, with some curiosity. "Nothing, but I can think of someone not 100 miles away." Then she turned to Poirot suddenly. "James sticks to it that you believe someone in the house committed the murder. All I can say is, you're wrong." "I should not like to be wrong," said Poirot. "It is not, how do you say, my métier." "I've got the facts pretty clearly," continued Caroline, taking no notice of Poirot's remark. "From James and others. As far as I can see, of the people in the house, only 2 could have had the chance of doing it. Ralph Paton and Flora Ackroyd. My dear Caroline? Now, James, don't interrupt me. I know what I'm talking about. Parker met her outside the door, didn't he? He didn't hear her uncle saying good night to her. She could have killed him then and there." "Caroline?" "I'm not saying she did, James. I'm saying she could have done. As a matter of fact, though Flora is like all these young girls nowadays, with no veneration for their betters, and thinking they know best on every subject under the sun, I don't for a minute believe she'd kill even a chicken. But there it is. Mr. Raymond and Major Blunt have alibis. Mrs. Ackroyd's got an alibi. Even that Russell woman seems to have one, and a good job for her it is she has. Who is left? Only Ralph and Flora. And say what you will, I don't believe Ralph Paton is a murderer, a boy we've known all our lives." Poirot was silent for a minute, watching the curling smoke rise from his cigarette. When at last he spoke, it was in a gentle, faraway voice that produced a curious impression. It was totally unlike his usual manner. Let us take a man, a very ordinary man, a man with no idea of murder in his heart. There is in him somewhere a strain of weakness, deep down. It has so far never been called into play. Perhaps it never will be, and if so, he will go to his grave honored and respected by everyone. But let us suppose that something occurs. He is in difficulties, or perhaps not that even. He may stumble by accident on a secret involving life or death to someone, and his first impulse will be to speak out, to do his duty as an honest citizen. And then the strain of weakness tells. Here is a chance of money, a great amount of money. He wants money. He desires it, and it is so easy. He has to do nothing for it, just keep silence. That is the beginning. The desire for money grows. He must have more and more. He is intoxicated by the gold mine which has opened at his feet. He becomes greedy, and in his greed he overreaches himself. One can press a man as far as one likes, but with a woman one must not press too far, for a woman has at heart a great desire to speak the truth. How many husbands who have deceived their wives go comfortably to their graves, carrying their secret with them? How many wives who have deceived their husbands wreck their lives by throwing the fact in those same husbands' teeth? They have been pressed too far. In a reckless moment, which they will afterwards regret, bien entendu, they fling safety to the winds and turn at bay, proclaiming the truth with great momentary satisfaction to themselves. So it was, I think, in this case. The strain was too great, and so there came your proverb, the death of the goose that laid the golden eggs. But that is not the end. Exposure faced the man of whom we are speaking, and he is not the same man he was, say, a year ago. His moral fibre is blunted. He is desperate, he is fighting a losing battle, and he is prepared to take any means that come to his hand, for exposure means ruin to him, and so the dagger strikes. He was silent for a moment. It was as though he had laid a spell upon the room. I cannot try to describe the impression his words produced. There was something in the merciless analysis and the ruthless power of vision which struck fear into both of us. Afterwards, he went on softly, the danger removed, he will be himself again, normal, kindly, but if the need again arises, then once more he will strike. Caroline roused herself at last. You are speaking of Ralph Petton, she said. You may be right, you may not, but you have no business to condemn a man unheard. The telephone bell rang sharply. I went out into the hall and took off the receiver. What? I said. Yes, Dr. Sheppard speaking. I listened for a minute or two, then replied briefly. Replacing the receiver, I went back into the drawing room. Poirot, I said, they have detained a man at Liverpool. His name is Charles Kent, and he is believed to be the stranger who visited Fernley that night. They want me to go to Liverpool at once and identify him.